The first field does not look like a revolution. It looks like a patch of disturbed earth beside a seasonal camp, a place where hands have pulled away competing plants and left the useful ones standing. It looks like a few seeds pushed into damp soil without ceremony. It looks like women, men, and children moving through a landscape they know almost as intimately as their own bodies, watching where wild barley grows thickest after winter rain, where gazelles cross the open ground, where tubers wait beneath the surface, where reeds gather along water, where fire can clear a slope and bring tender green shoots back after the ash cools. Nothing about it announces the end of one world and the beginning of another. Yet hidden inside that ordinary act is one of the strangest turns in the human story, because the people who begin to lean toward farming are not stepping out of misery into paradise. They are not starving primitives suddenly rescued by grain. Many of them already live with skill, variety, leisure, danger, memory, and movement. They know hundreds of plants, they follow animal migrations, they read weather from clouds, tracks from mud, ripeness from colour, and seasons from stars. They survive not because life is simple, but because their knowledge is vast. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the mystery here is not simply why farming began, it is why humanity accepted a bargain that made civilization possible, while also making so many lives harder. Long before ploughs, granaries, kings, taxes, cities, borders, and written laws, human beings live across the planet as foragers. The word can sound small, almost casual, as though it means wandering around until food appears. But foraging is not random wandering. It is an old and demanding intelligence practiced in motion. A hunting and gathering group must know when a landscape is generous and when it is lying. A valley green after rain may offer edible seeds, but it may also draw predators. A riverbank may give fish, shellfish, birds, reeds, clay, and drinking water, but it may flood without warning. A herd may promise meat and hides, but chasing it at the wrong moment wastes energy that cannot be replaced. The forager's world is not a supermarket without walls. It is a living map of risk and opportunity, and every person carries part of that map in memory. For most of the long story of Homo sapiens, this is how people live. Not in permanent villages surrounded by fields, but in bands and networks that shift with season, climate, animal movement, plant growth, and social ties. The evidence remains incomplete because mobile lives leave lighter traces than cities of brick and stone, but what survives in the record suggests a deeply flexible way of being. People make tools from stone, bone, wood, fibre, shell, antler, and resin. They stitch clothing. They shape spear points and blades. They burn landscapes deliberately. They carry ornaments across enormous distances. They bury their dead in ways that hint at grief, memory, and belief. They make images in caves and on rock faces, sometimes in places so dark and difficult to reach that the act itself seems to matter as much as the picture. They cross coastlines, deserts, mountains, forests, and ice. They reach Sahel, the joined Ice Age landmass of Australia and New Guinea. Tens of thousands of years before farming, they enter the Americas before any wheat field or rice paddy exists. Whatever else humans are, they are not waiting helplessly for agriculture to teach them how to survive. And yet this older world is not a lost Eden. It would be too easy, and just as false, to turn foragers into perfect people living in effortless harmony. Their lives can be violent, hungry, cold, exhausting, and short. Infants die. Injuries that modern medicine would repair can become fatal. A bad season can reduce a group to desperate choices. Some environments are rich enough to support dense populations, while others demand constant mobility and restraint. Scholars still debate how much leisure, health, conflict, and abundance varied across different foraging societies, and no single surviving group can be treated as a frozen copy of the Stone Age past. Still, one thing is clear before farming: human life is not a blank waiting to be filled. It is already a set of successful adaptations, refined over immense time. That makes the agricultural revolution harder to explain, and more interesting. If hunting and gathering could work so well, why did anyone trade it for fields? Why bend the back over soil? Why become dependent on a smaller range of foods? Why stay in one place long enough for waste to accumulate, for disease to spread, for neighbours to become rivals, for leaders to become permanent, for the year to harden into a schedule? The usual answer is simple. Farming produces more food. But the simple answer hides a complication. Farming can produce more food per acre, but not always more food per hour of labour. A field may feed more mouths, but it also demands clearing, planting, weeding, guarding, harvesting, threshing, grinding, storing, repairing, and starting again. It asks for patience, obedience, and repetition. It rewards planning, but punishes failure. It turns food from something found across a landscape into something concentrated in a vulnerable place. In the old mobile world, variety is a form of insurance. If one plant fails, another may ripen. If one herd moves away, fish or shellfish or nuts may fill the gap. If a campsite becomes dangerous or depleted, people can leave. Movement is not just a habit, it's a safety valve. But farming slowly narrows the field of dependence. Grain is powerful because it can be stored, counted, transported, and claimed. Grain is also dangerous because it makes hunger visible in one place. A granary full of seed can sustain a village through winter, but it can also attract raiders, rodents, insects, mold, rulers, and tax collectors. Long before there are empires, Grain begins to create a new kind of future, one that can be saved, stolen, measured, inherited, and lost. Some of the earliest hints of this transition appear not as grand monuments, but as subtle changes in daily life. Grinding stones become more common, sickles take on a glossy sheen from cutting silica-rich grass stems, storage pits appear, houses become more substantial, burials gather near settlements, dogs, already living in relationship with humans long before the main farming revolution, share camps and perhaps hunts. Wild cereals are harvested more heavily in parts of Southwest Asia. In other regions, people manage wetlands, encourage useful plants, move seeds, tend trees, or shape animal behaviour without becoming full-time farmers. The boundary between foraging and farming is not a wall, it is a marsh. People can stand in it for centuries, taking a few steps one way, then another, mixing cultivation with hunting, fishing, gathering, herding, exchange, and seasonal movement. This is one of the lesser-known truths about agriculture. It does not arrive everywhere as a sudden invention. It often begins as a relationship before it becomes a system. A stand of wild grain near camp is protected because it is useful. Seeds spilled near a dwelling sprout the next season. Plants with larger seeds or thinner husks are gathered more often, and without anyone intending to redesign a species, human preference begins to shape evolution. Animals that tolerate human presence gain access to scraps or protection. People notice. They return. They intervene a little more. The change can be so gradual that no one living through it would say a revolution has begun. A grandmother might remember when people moved camp more often. A child might grow up thinking the storage pit has always been there. The first farmers may not know they are farmers. They may think they are simply doing what their parents did, only slightly more. But slight changes can accumulate until they become a trap. A group that plants a little may need to remain nearby to harvest. A group that stores grain may need to guard it. A group that has more stored food may raise more children, and more children mean more mouths, which means more planting. A settlement that grows larger may exhaust nearby wild foods, making cultivation less optional. The system begins to close around its own success. What starts as an upgrade becomes a commitment. What starts as a supplement becomes a dependence. By the time people realise they cannot easily go back, the landscape around them may already be changed, their population larger, their tools specialised, their social obligations heavier, their dead buried beneath the floors of houses that bind memory to place. This is why farming can be called humanity's greatest upgrade and worst mistake in the same breath. It is the greatest upgrade because it makes possible dense populations, long-term settlements, monumental architecture, written records, mathematics, formal law, large-scale trade, armies, states, libraries, temples, ships, roads, cities, and eventually the modern world with all its medicines, machines, and impossible comforts. It is the worst mistake because it also brings new burdens. Epidemic disease, chronic labour, inequality, famine, war over land, ecological damage, rigid hierarchy, and a dangerous dependence on fragile systems. The phrase is deliberately uncomfortable. It does not mean early farmers were foolish. It means the bargain they entered was larger than anyone could see. Imagine, then, a human group at the edge of this transformation, somewhere in the broad belt of lands where wild grains bend in the wind after the Ice Age. Their camp is not primitive in the way old myths imagine. There are baskets, blades, hides, ornaments, hearths, stories, scars, jokes, memories of the dead, paths known by foot, and distant groups known by marriage and exchange. Children learn which seeds are worth collecting, and which look similar but bring sickness. Elders know where water remains late in the dry season. Hunters watch the behaviour of gazelle, deer, boar, or wild cattle. Gatherers return with nuts, fruits, roots, greens, and grasses. Smoke rises. Stone bites into wood. A body is buried carefully, perhaps with beads or tools, and the living remain close enough to remember the exact place. This is not a society without history. It is history before documents. The great turning point comes because this world is changing. The Ice Age loosens its grip. Glaciers withdraw. Seas rise. Forests shift. Grasslands expand or retreat. Animals move, vanish, or become harder to find. Human populations grow in some favourable regions. Familiar routes change. Coasts that once held camps disappear beneath water. New wetlands form. New opportunities appear, but so do new pressures. Farming does not emerge from a single cause. And scholars still debate the balance between climate change, population growth, cultural choice, accident, competition, feasting, risk management, and spiritual life. The evidence does not point to one moment when humanity chooses agriculture with a clear mind and signed agreement. It points instead to thousands of choices made under changing skies. The first section of this story then ends before the first true civilization begins. It ends in a world where people are still mostly free to move, but where certain places are becoming harder to leave. It ends where abundance gathers in patches, where seeds can be stored, where camps return to the same ground, where the dead begin to anchor the living, and where the future starts to feel less like an open landscape and more like a season that must be prepared for. The field is still small. The sickle is still simple. The village is not yet a city. No king has counted the grain. No tax collector has appeared at the door. But the path has begun to narrow, and once humanity steps further down it, almost everything changes. The world that opens the door to farming is not stable, quiet, or gentle. It It is a planet recovering from ice. For tens of thousands of years, human beings have lived through the cold rhythms of the Pleistocene, a time when glaciers lock away enormous volumes of water, sea levels fall, coastlines stretch far beyond their modern edges, deserts shift, forests retreat, and animals adapted to cold. Open environments roam across landscapes that no longer exist. Then the climate begins to loosen. Not all at once, not evenly, and not without reversals, but with enough force to redraw the map of human possibility. The great ice sheets shrink, rain belts move, rivers change course, sea levels rise and swallow old campsites along continental shelves. In some regions, warmer and wetter conditions invite forests and wild grains to spread. In others, warming brings dryness, stress, and a new uncertainty that presses people toward different strategies. Agriculture is born in this unsettled world, not because nature suddenly becomes generous everywhere, but because the old balance between people, plants, animals, and seasons begins to shift. In Southwest Asia, the region often called the Fertile Crescent becomes one of the most important stages for this transformation. The name can make it sound like a single lush garden, but the reality is more varied hills, steppe, river valleys, woodlands, wetlands, dry plains, and mountain edges, each offering different chances and risks. Wild wheat and barley grow naturally in parts of this zone. Wild sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle live within reach. Seasonal rains create cycles of abundance and scarcity. For mobile foragers, this is not simply a place to pass through. It is a landscape dense with possibility. Some groups can gather large quantities of wild cereal without planting anything. Some can hunt gazelle and other animals in predictable seasonal patterns. Some can return again and again to favoured locations because food appears there reliably enough to make repeated settlement worthwhile. One of the surprising details is that people are building substantial sites before full agriculture is established. The Natufian culture of the Levant, beginning before the end of the Ice Age, leaves behind stone houses or semi-permanent structures, heavy grinding stones, decorated objects, cemeteries, and signs of intensified wild grain use. These communities are not yet farmers in the full later sense, but they are also not living as highly mobile bands in the simplest way. They occupy an in-between world. They harvest wild cereals, they process seeds, they may stay in one place for longer periods, they bury their dead near home ground. At some sites, dogs are buried with humans, a quiet sign of an ancient partnership already woven into life. What survives in the record suggests that people are becoming attached to particular places before crops are fully domesticated, and that matters. Because staying longer changes the relationship between a group and its surroundings. Then comes a climatic shock that still sits near the centre of the debate. Around 12,900 years ago, after a period of warming, the Younger Dryas brings a return to colder and drier conditions in many parts of the Northern Hemisphere. In the Levant, conditions may have made some wild plant and animal resources less predictable. For communities that have already grown more settled and perhaps more dependent on gathered cereals, this kind of disruption could be severe. A highly mobile group can respond to scarcity by moving across a wider territory, but a semi-settled group with stored food, heavy tools, houses, graves, and social claims to place may not move so easily. Some scholars argue that the stress of the Younger Dryas encouraged cultivation as a way to stabilise food supply. Others caution that the evidence is more complicated, and that farming did not begin in a single emergency response. No single explanation fully accounts for this. Climate creates pressures and opportunities, but human choices, traditions, population, and local ecology shape what happens next. The same broad pattern, with different details, appears elsewhere. In China, the path toward farming unfolds around millets in the north and rice in the wetter south. Along the Yellow River and related regions, communities gradually make use of hardy grasses that can survive in relatively dry conditions. In the Yangtze Basin, rice emerges from wetland environments where people have long fished, gathered, hunted, and managed plants. In New Guinea, people begin tending and cultivating plants in highland wetlands, including taro and bananas, in ways that do not resemble the grain fields of Southwest Asia. In the Americas, squash, maize, beans, potatoes, manioc, and other crops follow their own long and regionally distinct histories. In Africa, sorghum, pearl millet, African rice, yams, and cattle herding become part of different agricultural worlds. Farming is not invented once and simply copied everywhere. It is invented, assembled, borrowed, resisted, modified, and reinvented in several places, under different skies. That difference is important because agriculture is not one thing: a wheat field, a rice paddy, a potato terrace, a maize plot, a yam garden, a banana grove, a cattle camp, and a floodplain garden all demand different forms of knowledge. They create different societies. Grain tends to be especially important in the rise of states because it ripens predictably, can be stored, can be divided into measurable units, and can be taken. Root crops can feed people well, but are harder for tax collectors to count and seize in the same way. Wet rice can support dense populations, but requires elaborate water control and coordinated labour. Pastoralism allows movement with animals, but it creates its own pressures around grazing, raiding, wealth, and drought. The climate door opens in many places, but people walk through it in different ways. In the centuries after the Ice Age, one of the great invisible forces is rising population. This does not mean the world is crowded in any modern sense. It means that in favoured regions, there may be more people using the same productive landscapes. When a group is small, mobility can solve many problems. When more families return to the same valleys, lakeshores, and hunting grounds, movement becomes more socially complicated. Territories matter more. Seasonal resources are claimed more strongly. Marriages and alliances carry more weight. A patch of wild grain is no longer just a patch of wild grain. It is a known place, perhaps inherited in memory, perhaps defended, perhaps improved. The line between managing a resource and owning it is not sharp, but it begins somewhere in this tightening relationship between people and land. Warmer climates also create new kinds of abundance that can seduce people into staying. Along rivers and wetlands, fish, birds, reeds, tubers, shellfish, and edible seeds may support large gatherings. On the edges of woodlands, nuts and fruits can be collected in quantity. Wild cereal stands can be harvested with impressive efficiency when conditions are right. A settled life may begin not from desperation, but from richness. This is one of the contradictions at the heart of the story. Farming may partly emerge in places where people have enough food to experiment, stay, build, store, and grow in number. Then, once population and settlement increase, the same communities become more vulnerable to shortage. Abundance creates commitment, and commitment creates pressure. The rising seas add another layer. As the glaciers melt, coastlines move landward, sometimes over many generations, sometimes with dramatic local effects. The evidence for early coastal living is often drowned, which means archaeologists are missing some of the very places where human adaptation may have been most creative. Shellfish, fish traps, boats, coastal plants, and wetlands may have supported communities whose traces now lie beneath shallow seas. The map of early agriculture and settlement is therefore partly a map of what survived above water. Scholars still debate how much has been lost, but the loss itself is certain. Humanity's first experiments with staying put may have been broader and stranger than the dryland record reveals. Meanwhile, plants themselves are changing under human attention. A wild grain head naturally shatters when ripe, scattering seeds so the plant can reproduce. For a human harvester, that trait is inconvenient. Seeds that cling to the stalk are easier to gather. If people repeatedly collect and later sow seeds from plants that hold together longer, they unintentionally favour non-shattering varieties, over generations. This can transform a wild grass into a domesticated crop dependent on human harvesting and planting. The plant gains a new evolutionary partner, but loses some of its old freedom. Humans, in turn, gain a more reliable harvest while becoming dependent on the plant's cycle. Domestication is often described as control, but is also mutual captivity. Animals move along a similar but not identical path. Some species are far more suitable for domestication than others. They must tolerate humans, breed in managed conditions, grow reasonably fast, eat available foods, and fit into social structures humans can manipulate. Sheep and goats, for example, are very different partners from gazelle, which were hunted heavily in the Levant but never domesticated in the same way. The reason is not simply that ancient people failed to think of it. Gazelle are fast, nervous, and difficult to contain. Goats, by comparison, can be managed around herding patterns and social behaviour. This is a useful reminder that agriculture is constrained by biology. Humans do not domesticate whatever they desire. They work with the species that can survive the bargain. As the climate settles into the Holocene, the warmer epoch in which all later civilization develops, the old Ice Age world fades. Mammoths and other megafauna disappear in many regions through combinations of climate change, habitat shift, and human hunting. Though the balance differs by place and remains debated. Forests cover former open ground. Rivers stabilise in some regions and become lifelines for future farming societies. Seasonal rhythms become more predictable than they were during the sharp swings of the late Pleistocene. Predictability matters. A farmer needs faith that the season will return in a recognisable form. Too much chaos makes planting foolish. Enough regularity makes it tempting. But temptation is not destiny. For thousands of years, many communities continue to combine foraging, hunting, fishing, cultivation, and herding. Some adopt crops but keep moving. Some farm part of the year. Some abandon cultivation when conditions change. Some refuse it for generations despite living near farmers. The agricultural world does not simply replace the foraging world like dawn replacing night. It spreads unevenly, hesitates, fails, advances, and absorbs older ways of life. The climate door opens, but people still have to decide whether to enter, and many pause at the threshold. The deeper mystery is that once enough people enter, the door begins to close behind them. Warmer weather, wild grain, useful animals, rivers, and seasonal predictability make farming possible, but they also create the conditions for dependence. A field asks its people to return, a herd asks to be guarded, a storehouse asks to be defended, a village asks to be maintained. Children born into that village inherit not only food, but obligation. The Ice Age had demanded movement across a vast and changing world. The New Age begins to demand staying, repeating, investing, and waiting. Somewhere in that shift, the human future turns from the open trail toward the cultivated horizon, where the promise of security waits beside the first shadow of captivity. At first, the seeds do not seem like a trap. They seem like insurance. They are small enough to carry, abundant enough to matter, and patient in a way fresh meat and ripe fruit are not. A basket of grain can wait. A buried cache can survive a lean week. A storage pit lined with care can turn one good season into a promise against the next bad one. For people living in a world where weather is never fully obedient and animals do not always arrive on schedule, this is a remarkable discovery. Food no longer has to be only chased, dug, plucked, trapped, or gathered in the moment. It can be held back. It can be saved for children, elders, ceremonies, journeys, or hunger not yet visible. That ability to delay consumption may sound simple, but it begins to change the emotional structure of human life. The future becomes something that can be physically touched. It sits in a basket, it lies under a floor, it waits in the dark. The earliest cultivation probably begins in this half-practical, half-accidental world of return and attention. People harvest wild stands of wheat, barley, rye, or other grasses, and they notice where the best patches grow. They clear away useless plants, they scatter seeds in a camp, they burn ground at the right moment. They protect certain areas from grazing animals. They may not think of themselves as inventing agriculture. They may simply be improving a place that already feeds them. What survives in the record suggests that for a very long time, the line between gathering wild grain and cultivating domesticated grain remains blurred. A group can harvest intensively without farming. Another can plant without fully depending on the harvest. Another can cultivate for generations while still hunting, fishing, gathering nuts, collecting fruit, and moving seasonally. The trap is not sprung in a single moment. It tightens through usefulness. The wild grasses themselves help set the terms. In parts of Southwest Asia, wild cereals grow in dense stands, especially in zones where rainfall, soil, and season align. They offer a food that is not glamorous but is powerful. Grain is compact. It is calorie-rich. It can be dried. It can be stored. It can be ground into meal and cooked into porridge or flatbread, but it is also laborious. A seed head must be cut or stripped. The grain must be separated from husk and straw. It must be winnowed. Pounded, ground, mixed, cooked, and protected. Every mouthful carries hidden hours. A roasted gazelle announces its effort in the hunt. A bowl of gruel hides its effort in the hands, wrists, backs, and knees of those who process the harvest. One of the quiet revolutions of farming begins not in the field, but at the grinding stone. Those stones are among the most intimate artifacts of the transition. They are not spectacular like temples or statues. They are heavy, worn, ordinary, and deeply revealing. A grinding stone means repeated use. It means food processing in one place. It means someone has spent long hours kneeling or crouching, pushing another stone back and forth until hard seeds become flour. In many early communities, this work likely falls heavily on women. Though the exact division of labour varies and the evidence remains incomplete, the bones of some early agricultural people show strain in arms, shoulders, knees, and spine, the marks of repetitive work rather than heroic drama. The agricultural revolution is often imagined as a triumph of invention, but much of it is the story of bodies bent over plants that cannot be eaten easily until they have been forced open. Yet the reward is real. Grain gives density. A landscape that might support a small mobile group through mixed foraging can, under cultivation, feed more people in a smaller area. This does not always mean better nutrition, and it certainly does not mean less work, but it changes the arithmetic of survival. More children can be weaned onto soft cereal foods. More people can remain near stored supplies. More labour becomes available for planting and harvesting, which then supports more people still. A loop begins to form. Food supports population. Population demands food. Demand encourages more cultivation. More cultivation reduces the space and time available for older forms of subsistence. The seed becomes not just a resource, but a command. This is where the trap becomes subtle. A community that stores grain has something to lose. A community that plants has a reason to stay until harvest. A community that stays has houses, tools, paths, hearths, graves, and memories fixed to a place. A community with more children cannot easily return to a life that supported fewer people. Even if some elders remember a wider range of movement, the young may inherit a world already narrowed by success. They are not prisoners in the obvious sense. No wall surrounds them at first, but the field creates invisible walls made of timing, labour, investment, and need. Leave too early, and the crop fails. Ignore the weeds, and the yield falls. Fail to guard the store, and hunger enters through another creature's mouth. Rodents, insects, and mould are among agriculture's first uninvited companions. Stored grain is a miracle only if it survives storage. A pit can become damp, a jar can crack, mice can find what people hide, beetles can multiply unseen, fungi can spoil food or poison it. The more food is concentrated, the more attractive it becomes to everything that eats. This is a lesser known but crucial detail. Farming does not simply produce food. It produces ecological opportunity for pests. The village granary is a human achievement, but from the perspective of a rat, a mouse, or a weevil, it is also a banquet hall. People respond with cats in some regions much later, with sealed containers, raised floors, plastered bins, watchfulness, and perhaps ritual anxiety. But the problem never disappears. Agriculture gathers life around itself, including life humans do not want. Storage also changes social relationships. Food kept for later must be protected, remembered, divided, and justified. Who filled the pit? Who owns what lies inside? Who may eat during shortage? Who decides when seed grain can be consumed and when it must be saved for planting? These questions do not require kings yet. They can arise inside households, kin groups, and small villages, but they mark a shift from immediate sharing toward delayed claims among many mobile foraging groups. Generosity and sharing are not sentimental luxuries, they are survival strategies that spread risk. A hunter who succeeds today may fail tomorrow, so meat moves through social networks. Stored grain behaves differently, it can be hidden, it can be counted, it can become private, family-based, inherited, or controlled by those who command labour. Scholars still debate how quickly inequality emerged in different early farming communities, but the storage of food clearly made new forms of inequality possible. The seed trap also reaches into time. Foragers know time through seasons, migrations, ripening, weather, moonlight, animal behaviour, and memory. Farmers must know all of this too, but with a sharper anxiety. The right moment to plant matters, the right moment to harvest matters. Rain matters not just as weather, but as judgment. A late frost, a failed flood, a dry spring, or a swarm of pests can undo months of work. Farming gives people more control over food production, but it also binds them to cycles beyond control. This is one of its deepest contradictions. It makes humans more powerful and more vulnerable at the same time. The first cultivated fields are likely small by later standards, but their psychological weight is enormous. They ask people to trust in delayed reward, they ask them to work before hunger is present, they ask them to imagine a future season and organise life around it. Such planning is not new. Hunter-gatherers plan constantly, but cultivation concentrates planning into a fixed place and a fixed crop. A field becomes a calendar written in soil. The seeds go in. And from that moment, the community has entered into an agreement with weather, labour, insects, animals, neighbours, and luck. There is another strange transformation hidden inside the seed itself. Wild plants do not exist for human convenience. They scatter, defend, poison, cling, disperse, and compete. Under repeated human harvesting and planting, certain traits become favoured: large seeds, thinner seed coats, synchronised ripening, less shattering, easier processing. These changes are not always deliberately chosen. Early cultivators may simply gather what is easiest and most useful, and sow from those stores. Over generations, however, the plant population changes. A domesticated grain may become less able to survive without people. It waits for human hands to clear ground, place seed, protect growth, and harvest. In return, humans become less able to survive without the grain. Two species, once independent, begin to pull each other into a shared dependency. This is why domestication should not be imagined only as conquest. It is not simply humans mastering nature. It is a negotiation conducted through hunger and reproduction. Wheat changes humans by demanding fields, harvests, storage, and settlement. Humans change wheat by spreading it into environments where it might never have dominated alone. From one angle, people domesticate plants. From another, plants recruit people to carry their seeds across continents. This is not a mystical claim, only an evolutionary one. A successful crop becomes one of the most widespread organisms on Earth by making itself useful to a primate with tools, fire, memory, and ambition. The trap does not close everywhere in the same way. In some regions, people cultivate for centuries without becoming fully dependent. In others, farming expands quickly once domesticated forms appear. Some communities may adopt crops because they fit into existing ceremonies, feasts, or exchanges. Grain can make beer or special foods, not just daily meals. Feasting may have helped encourage cultivation, because gatherings require surplus and surplus brings prestige. The evidence for this varies, and no single explanation fully accounts for the transition. But it reminds us that people do not seek calories alone. They seek status, alliance, memory, pleasure, obligation, and meaning. A seed can feed the body, but it can also feed a ceremony. And so, little by little, the world around the early cultivator changes. Paths harden between houses and fields. Tools become more specialised. Children learn the names of planted places. Elders remember harvests, floods, failures, and signs in the weather. The dead lie near the living, and the living return each season not only because food grows there, but because the place now contains their own past. The field is no longer just useful. It is familiar. It is claimed. It's worked by hands that expect descendants to work it too. By the time agriculture becomes unavoidable, no one needs to announce that humanity has crossed a threshold. The proof is in the daily schedule. People wake with tasks waiting in the same place as yesterday. They watch the sky not as travellers deciding where to go, but as farmers hoping the field will be spared. They store seed and fear hunger in a new way, because the future has become both more planned and more fragile. The first seed once looked like freedom from uncertainty. It promised food that could wait, but buried inside that promise was a demand that humans wait with it, season after season, until the open world of movement began to shrink around the cultivated ground. The first villages rise quietly, not as cities in miniature, and not as the inevitable next step towards civilization, but as experiments in staying. A place that once received people for a season begins to hold them longer. A camp becomes familiar enough to rebuild. A hearth is remade in nearly the same spot. A storage pit is dug a little deeper. A wall of mud, wood, reed, or stone begins to separate inside from outside. Not permanently at first, perhaps not even confidently. But with a new assumption hidden in its shape, someone expects to return. That expectation changes everything. To stay is to accumulate. Tools that were once too heavy to carry become useful. grinding stones, storage bins, plastered floors, roof beams, baskets, sleeping places, refuse heaps, and graves begin to gather into a landscape of belonging. What once had to fit on the body or in a bundle can now remain behind, waiting like a second memory. The earliest settled communities do not all look alike. Some are small clusters of houses, some are dense villages, some are seasonal gathering places that gradually become harder to leave. Some are built near springs, lakes, rivers, marshes, or rich stands of wild plants. In Southwest Asia, sites such as Jericho, Abu Huraira, and Çatalhöyük later become famous because they preserve unusually vivid traces of early settled life, though each belongs to its own time and context. Jericho has massive walls and a tower by very early standards, though scholars still debate whether these were built mainly for defence, flood control, social display, ritual purpose, or some combination not fully visible in the evidence. Abu Huraira shows a long transition from foraging toward farming, with changing plant use and signs of hard labour written into human bones. Çatalhöyük, later still, becomes a packed settlement of mud brick houses entered from rooftops. With burials beneath floors and walls decorated with animal imagery, handprints, and installations that continue to puzzle archaeologists. None of these places is a simple prototype for everything that follows, but each reveals something essential. Settled life creates new possibilities and new pressures at the same time. A village gathers abundance, but it also gathers waste. This is one of the less glamorous truths of the agricultural revolution, and one of the most important. Mobile groups leave refuse behind and move away from it. Settled groups live beside what they discard: ash, broken tools, food scraps, animal bones, human waste, dirty water, rotting plant matter, and dead pests become part of the local environment. At first, the scale may be manageable. But as populations grow and houses stand closer together, the village becomes an ecological machine with problems no one had faced in quite the same way before. Flies breed, parasites circulate, water sources can be fouled, smoke from indoor hearths affects lungs and eyes, animals kept near people bring milk, meat, hides, wool, traction, manure, and danger. The benefits are real, but so are the biological consequences. The settlement is a shelter, a storehouse, a memory place, and a disease experiment. The houses themselves reveal a changing relationship with life and death. In many early farming or semi-farming settlements, the dead are not placed far away in separate cemeteries, as they often are in later societies. They may be buried beneath house floors, under sleeping platforms, or within the settlement. Sometimes skulls are removed, plastered, painted, or kept, suggesting practices of ancestor remembrance that are still debated. To modernise, this can seem eerie. But it may reflect a world where the household is not only a shelter for the living, but a vessel of continuity. The dead anchor claims they hold memory and place. A house built over ancestors is more than real estate. It is a statement that a family, lineage, or community belongs here. What survives in the record suggests that settlement does not merely follow farming. It also helps create the emotional and ritual weight that makes leaving harder. Inside these villages, daily life becomes more crowded, more cooperative, and more tense. People share walls, paths, water sources, workspaces, and obligations. They must coordinate harvests, repairs, storage, feasts, childcare, animal management, and defense against pests or enemies. They also have more chances to irritate one another, compete with one another, compare possessions, and remember debts. A mobile group can sometimes solve conflict by separating. A village cannot always do that. Its strength is proximity, and its danger is proximity. The same closeness that makes cooperation efficient makes resentment durable. In a settlement, reputation thickens. Everyone knows who works, who hoards, who marries whom, who has many children, who controls a store, who gives generously, and who does not. The architecture of early villages often reflects this mix of intimacy and constraint. In some places, houses are relatively similar, suggesting limited inequality. In others, differences emerge in size, contents, location, or access to storage. Archaeologists look for clues in burial goods, house plans, food remains, craft tools, and signs of differential nutrition. But the evidence remains incomplete, and social life rarely leaves a clean signature. A larger house might mean greater wealth. A bigger family, a communal function, or simply a different building history. Still, over time, settled communities make inequality easier to preserve. A family can accumulate stored food, tools, land rights, animals, ornaments, or ritual authority. The next generation can inherit not only knowledge, but material advantage. The village gives memory a physical address. It also changes childhood. In a mobile foraging world, children learn by moving through varied landscapes, watching adults gather, hunt, cook, repair, track, and negotiate. In a village, children still learn from observation, but the range of tasks shifts. They may herd animals, scare birds from fields, fetch water, gather fuel, tend younger siblings, help process grain, shape clay, twist fibres, or carry small loads. The work of farming societies is divisible into countless small tasks. And children can contribute early. This matters because agriculture can support larger families partly by making child labour useful within the household economy. A toddler cannot follow a long hunt, but an older child can guard goats, collect dung, or help with weeding. The family becomes a production unit more tightly bound to place and season. Village life also invites craft specialisation, though not immediately in the full urban sense. When people remain in one place, they can maintain kilns, storage areas, workshops, and tool-making spaces. Pottery becomes especially important in many settled societies, though it does not appear everywhere at the same stage. Pots are heavy and breakable, inconvenient for highly mobile groups but perfect for storing, cooking, fermenting, and serving in permanent settlements. A pot is not just a container, it changes cuisine. It allows boiling, stewing, softening grains and legumes, feeding infants and elders, storing liquids, and transforming foods that might otherwise be difficult to digest. In some regions, pottery appears before full farming. In others, farming comes first. The sequence varies, reminding us again that the agricultural revolution is not a single staircase climbed in the same order by everyone. Food itself becomes more social and more political. A harvest can be eaten privately, shared in a household, offered in ritual, exchanged with neighbours, or displayed in a feast. Feasting is one of the great engines of early social complexity. To host a feast, a person or group must gather surplus. To gather surplus, they must mobilise labour or control resources. To feed others generously can create gratitude, obligation, prestige, alliance, and dependency. A feast looks like abundance, but it may also be a subtle form of power. Scholars still debate how important feasting was in the rise of agriculture, but in many societies food is never merely nutrition. It is a language of rank, care, debt, and belonging. The village also has to defend itself. Though defence may mean many things, it may mean protection from animals, floods, raiders, rival groups, or even internal disorder. Walls and ditches are among the most dramatic archaeological features, but they are difficult to interpret. A wall may be military, symbolic, practical, environmental, or several of these at once. Still, the need to protect stored food and settled people is new in scale. A mobile group can lose a camp and survive. A village that loses its harvest may face catastrophe. Stored grain concentrates value, and concentrated value attracts danger. The first villages are not necessarily violent fortresses, but they exist in a world where wealth can no longer simply walk away. Something else happens as people stay. The landscape around the village begins to change visibly. Nearby trees are cut for fuel, tools, roofs, fences, and cleared fields. Wild animals avoid crowded areas or are hunted down. Paths become worn. Soil is turned, dung accumulates, useful plants spread, weeds adapted to disturbed ground appear. Human settlement creates a new ecological niche, and some species flourish in it: sparrows, mice, rats, insects, weeds, dogs, pigs. And later, cats all find opportunities around human places. The village is not outside nature. It is nature reorganised around human appetite. For the people living through it, these changes may not feel like a loss. The village offers warmth, continuity, stored food, neighbours, rituals, and a sense of place. It allows the old to remain where they are known. It gives children a home ground thick with stories. It creates spaces where memory can be built into walls and floors. It may reduce some dangers of constant movement, even as it introduces others. To call farming a mistake without acknowledging this would be too easy. People stayed because staying gave them something powerful. They could build, bury, remember, and return. They could make a landscape human in a new way. But every gift carries a hook. The longer a village lasts, the more difficult it becomes to imagine life without it. Heavy tools, stored grain, planted fields, family houses, buried ancestors, nearby marriages, familiar paths, and growing numbers of children all pull people inward. Mobility does not vanish overnight, but it becomes less available as a solution. A failed harvest is no longer merely one bad event in a wide landscape of options. It is a threat to the whole settled world. A conflict with neighbours can become a conflict over land that cannot be easily abandoned. A disease can move through houses that stand close enough for breath, waste, animals, and insects to connect them. So the first villages rise as both refuge and snare. They are among humanity's most creative inventions, but they are also among the first places where humans begin to live inside systems too large for any one person to control. They gather food, memory, labour, craft, ritual, and ancestry into one place. They make possible the later city, the temple, the archive, the marketplace, and the state. Yet they also gather sickness, inequality, obligation, conflict, and ecological strain. In the old mobile world, a group could often answer trouble with movement. In the village, trouble begins to move in with them, and once the house, the field, the storage pit, and the grave all occupy the same ground, leaving becomes more than relocation, it becomes a kind of forgetting. Domestication changes everything because it does not stop at food. It reaches into bodies, landscapes, habits, diseases, seasons, myths, and the hidden chemistry of daily life. At first glance, it seems like a practical arrangement. Humans protect certain plants and animals, and those species become more useful in return. Wheat gives larger seeds, barley waits for harvest, lentils and peas enter storage jars, goats tolerate herding, sheep become walking bundles of meat, milk, hide, bone. And eventually wool, pigs turn scraps into flesh, cattle offer power, status, milk, blood, dung, traction, and danger. But beneath this exchange lies something stranger. Domestication is not simply humans changing other species. It is a shared transformation in which humans also become domesticated by the needs of the organisms they depend on. The plants are the quietest partners and perhaps the most successful. A wild grass only needs to survive well enough to scatter its seeds. The domesticated cereal follows a different destiny. Its seed head becomes less likely to shatter naturally, which would be disastrous for a wild plant but useful for a harvester. Its seeds grow larger, its growth becomes more synchronized. It increasingly depends on people to clear soil, plant seed, protect the crop, and carry it into new territory. From the plant's perspective, this dependency is not failure, it is expansion. Wheat, barley, rice, maize, and millet spread across continents because humans carry them, defend them, and reshape whole landscapes around their cycles. A crop that cannot walk persuades a restless primate to move it everywhere. The animals transform more visibly. Wild sheep and goats are wary, agile, and shaped by predators, mountains, and hard seasons. Under human management, the balance shifts. Animals that are less aggressive, less nervous, and more tolerant of crowding are easier to keep. Horn shape, body size, coat, breeding patterns, and behaviour begin to change. Humans select, deliberately or not, for animals that fit human schedules. The herd becomes a moving store of wealth. It can turn scrub and grass into meat and milk. It can reproduce. It can be exchanged, sacrificed, stolen, counted, and inherited. A sack of grain can rot, but a goat can make another goat. This gives livestock a peculiar power in early farming societies. Animals are food, tools, companions, offerings, capital, and symbols all at once. Yet the bargain has teeth. Herds must be guarded, watered, bred, moved, and protected from predators and thieves. They compete with humans for land and crops. They can destroy fields if poorly managed. They carry parasites. They transmit disease. They create disputes over grazing and ownership. They also change human mobility in complicated ways. Some farming communities become more settled because of fields. Others remain partly mobile because animals require pasture. Pastoralists follow herds across grasslands, deserts, highlands, and seasonal routes, creating societies that are neither simple farmers nor old-style foragers. Agriculture, once again, is not one path. It is a widening family of dependencies. Milk offers one of the most revealing examples of how domestication reshapes humans themselves. Most mammals lose the ability to digest lactose after infancy. Yet in several human populations with long histories of dairying, genetic changes spread that allow many adults to digest milk. This does not happen because someone decides it should happen. It happens because, in certain environments, adults who can use milk gain an advantage. Milk provides calories, fluid, fat, protein, and a renewable food source that does not require killing the animal. In dry regions, it can be especially valuable. But lactose tolerance is uneven across the world, and scholars still debate the exact pressures that made it spread where it did. What is clear is that herding did not merely add milk to the menu, it altered human evolution. Grain changes human bodies too, though more through diet and labour than through a single dramatic adaptation. A diet based heavily on cereals can feed many people, but it can also narrow nutrition. Compared with diverse foraging diets, early farming diets often contain more carbohydrates and fewer wild foods, depending on region and class. Teeth may show more cavities because starches and sticky cooked grains feed mouth bacteria. Bones may show signs of stress, anemia, infection, or repetitive labour. The evidence varies across sites, and no single pattern fits all early farmers. But the broad picture is uncomfortable domestication increases food production, without automatically increasing health. A society can grow larger while many of its individuals become less robust. This is one of the hardest truths in the story. Success at the population level can coexist with suffering at the bodily level. The domesticated landscape also begins to fill with new categories of life crops: weeds, livestock, pests, commensals, and pathogens. A weed is not simply a bad plant. It is a plant that thrives in the disturbed habitats humans create. Fields, paths, dung heaps, walls, and irrigation channels open opportunities for species-adapted disruption. Mice and rats follow stored grain. Sparrows and other birds follow fields. Insects adapt to dense stands of similar plants. Fungal diseases exploit storage and dampness. Human beings, trying to simplify the landscape for food, create new complexity around themselves. The farm is not a conquered wilderness. It is a negotiated ecosystem, and many of its negotiators are invisible until something goes wrong. Disease is one of the darkest parts of this bargain. When humans live close to animals, waste, insects, and one another, infections gain new pathways. Not every major disease appears immediately with the first farmers, and the history of pathogens is complicated. Some diseases require dense populations large enough to sustain transmission, which become more common later with towns and cities. Others may move through smaller communities in different forms, but the general direction is clear. Settlement, crowding, poor sanitation, malnutrition, and animal proximity create conditions in which parasites and infectious diseases can flourish. The same village that protects grain through winter may also protect the chain of transmission that keeps illness alive. Dung, strangely, is both problem and solution. Animal manure fouls living spaces, attracts insects, and carries parasites. It also fertilizes fields, fuels fires in treeless landscapes, strengthens plaster, and becomes part of household technology. In some regions, dried dung is an essential fuel, a quiet reminder that domestication changes not only what people eat, but how they cook, build, heat, and survive. The useful and the dangerous are rarely separate. They arrive together. Sometimes in the same basket, sometimes under the same roof. Firewood creates another pressure. Settled people need fuel every day. They need wood for cooking, warmth, construction, fences, tools, pottery firing, lime plaster, and later, metallurgy. As villages grow, nearby woodlands can shrink. People walk farther for fuel. They turn to dung, reeds, shrubs, crop waste, or managed woodland. Deforestation is not always immediate and not always catastrophic, but the demand is persistent. A mobile camp leaves a small wound. A permanent settlement keeps reopening it. Over generations, the edge of the village expands into the surrounding ecology. Domestication also changes the meaning of animals in human imagination. Wild animals are hunted, feared, admired, painted, tracked, and ritually powerful. Domestic animals are intimate in another way. They live beside people. They are born under human watch. They are named in some societies, counted in many, sacrificed in others, milked, sheared, slaughtered, mourned, or treated as wealth. The boundary between companion and commodity becomes uneasy. A lamb may be cared for tenderly and later eaten. A bull may be revered and feared, bred and killed. These contradictions are not signs of hypocrisy. They are part of the deep emotional complexity of living with dependent creatures that are also resources. Plants acquire meaning too. Grain can become sacred because survival depends on it. A harvest failure is never just an economic event. It can feel like cosmic disorder. Seeds buried in earth and rising again lend themselves to stories of death, return, fertility, and renewal. The agricultural year teaches patience and dread. It makes time circular, but also accumulative. Each year repeats the last, yet each year can also build surplus, debt, population, and memory. Ritual calendars begin to grow from the needs of planting, rain, flood, ripening, and storage. The gods of farming societies, where they later appear in written records, often care deeply about weather, fertility, rivers, grain, and herds. This is not surprising. People tend to sacralize whatever holds their lives hostage. The genetic changes in domesticated species are often easier to see than the social changes in humans, but the social changes are just as profound. A farmer must think in generations. Seed is saved from one harvest for the next. Animals are bred across years. Land is improved slowly. Orchards may not bear fully for years. Irrigation channels require maintenance. Terraces require repair. Children inherit work already begun before their birth. This creates continuity, but also obligation. The future stops being a distant uncertainty and becomes a debt owed to the field, the herd, and the household. There is a cruel asymmetry in this arrangement. Domesticated species can become extraordinarily successful as species while individual plants and animals are controlled, confined, harvested, milked, castrated, bred, and killed. Humans too become extraordinarily successful as a species while many individual humans work harder, eat more narrowly, suffer more disease, and live under tightening social demands. This is why the agricultural bargain is so difficult to judge. Evolution does not measure happiness. It measures reproduction and persistence. By that standard, farming is astonishingly successful. By the standard of daily human experience, the verdict is far more troubled. The evidence remains incomplete, and it differs across regions. There were farming communities that adapted well, mixed crops with wild foods, managed risk intelligently, and built rich social worlds. There were also communities trapped by drought, soil exhaustion, disease, violence, or inequality. Domestication did not automatically doom anyone, just as it didn't automatically save anyone. It opened a new field of possibility, and possibility is never innocent. By the time plants and animals are fully drawn into human life, the human world has become less wild in one sense and more dangerous in another. The field is cleared, but pests arrive. The herd is enclosed, but disease crosses the fence. The grain is stored, but power gathers around the storehouse. The village is fed, but its people depend on species that now demand constant care. Humans have not stepped outside nature. They have entered a tighter contract with it, written in seed, bone, milk. Dung, labour, and hunger. Domestication is the moment the upgrade becomes irreversible, because once humans change the species around them, those species begin changing the humans in return. The body is where the bargain becomes hardest to romanticize. Grand stories of civilization usually rise upward toward temples, laws, writing, armies, and cities. But the first evidence of farming's cost is often found lower down, in worn teeth, bent bones, infected joints, damaged spines, and skeletons that quietly refuse to support the idea that agriculture was an uncomplicated improvement. The field may feed more people, but it does not necessarily feed each person better. The village may protect a community from certain dangers, but it exposes them to others. When the dead are studied closely, they bring an uncomfortable message from the beginning of the farming world. Humanity's greatest upgrade often made individual human lives more physically punishing. This does not mean every forager was healthy or every farmer miserable. The evidence remains incomplete, and survival always depends on local ecology, climate, diet, disease, conflict, and social inequality. But across many early agricultural populations, archaeologists and bioanthropologists have found patterns that are difficult to ignore. Compared with many earlier foraging groups, early farmers often show signs of nutritional stress, more dental disease, repetitive strain, infectious lesions, and sometimes reduced stature. The details vary by region, and scholars still debate how much each factor mattered. But the broad pattern reveals a strange contradiction. Farming can make a population grow, while making many bodies within that population suffer more. Teeth tell part of the story with brutal clarity. A hunter-gatherer diet can be tough on teeth in its own ways, especially when food contains grit from stone grinding or sand from the environment. But heavy reliance on cooked starches, grain porridges, and sticky carbohydrates changes the mouth. Bacteria thrive on sugars and starches, acids attack enamel, and cavities become more common in many farming communities. Tooth loss, abscesses, and jaw infections can follow. A small cavity in a world without dentistry is not small for long. It can become pain, swelling, fever, and sometimes death. The agricultural revolution, seen through the mouth, is not only the story of bread, it is also the story of decay. The grinding stones introduced earlier return here as instruments of both survival and injury. Grain must be processed again and again, and the work leaves marks. Knees, hips, shoulders, elbows, wrists, and lower backs carry the repetition. In some early farming populations, skeletons show patterns consistent with long hours of grinding, hauling, digging, harvesting, and carrying. This labour is not evenly distributed. Women in many agricultural societies likely carry a heavy share of food processing, childcare, water collection, fuel gathering, and field work, though the exact division differs across cultures and cannot always be read cleanly from bones. What can be said is that farming multiplies repetitive tasks. It turns survival into maintenance. The harvest may be seasonal, but the work is nearly endless. Diet narrows in many farming communities, especially where one or two staple crops dominate. Grain is a magnificent source of calories, but calories are not the same as complete nourishment. A diet too dependent on cereals can lack certain proteins, fats, vitamins, and minerals unless balanced with legumes, meat, fish, dairy, wild plants, or trade. Early farmers often do maintain mixed diets, especially at first. But as populations grow and landscapes are transformed, diversity can shrink. Signs of anemia, enamel defects from childhood stress, and growth disruptions appear in some skeletal remains. These marks are not diaries, and they do not explain themselves perfectly. They are clues. What survives in the record suggests that many children in early farming communities endure periods of illness or hunger severe enough to interrupt the growth of teeth and bones. Height is another clue, though a complicated one. In some regions, average stature declines after the adoption of farming, likely reflecting a mix of poorer nutrition, heavier disease burden, and social stress. Height is not a simple measure of well-being, and genetic background matters, but broad changes across populations can reveal shifts in childhood health. A shorter adult body may record a childhood of repeated infections or inadequate diet. Here again, the agricultural paradox appears. More food in total does not automatically mean healthier people. A village can produce enough grain to support more births while individual children grow under greater stress. Disease thrives where people, animals, waste, and crowding meet. Settled farming communities create exactly those conditions. Parasites spread through contaminated soil and water. Respiratory infections move more easily when people live close together. Zoonotic diseases have more chances to cross from animals to humans, even if many famous epidemic diseases require later urban populations to become fully established. Smoke from indoor fires can irritate lungs. Stored food attracts rodents and insects that carry their own risks. Waste disposal becomes a permanent problem. In a mobile camp, filth is often left behind. In a village, it becomes part of the neighbourhood. There is also the matter of famine, which seems at first like something farming should solve. Stored food can protect against seasonal hunger, and in many cases it surely does. But dependence on crops creates new vulnerability. A drought, flood, frost, pest outbreak, plant disease, or conflict during harvest can devastate a food supply that has become too concentrated. Foragers also face hunger, sometimes severe hunger, but their risk is often spread across many species and places. Farmers can produce more, but they can also fail more dramatically. A field is a promise made to the future, and the future does not always keep its side of the bargain. The body pays in violence as well. Farming makes land more valuable in a fixed way. Fields, stores, wells, herds, and houses cannot be moved easily. This does not mean violence begins with agriculture. Conflict is far older than farming. But settled life changes what violence can be about. A raid can seize grain, a herd can be stolen, a boundary can be defended, a village can be burned, skeletal trauma, fortifications, mass graves. And weapons suggest that violence becomes a significant part of life in some early settled societies, though patterns vary greatly and scholars still debate causes in particular cases. What matters is that farming creates wealth that stays put, and wealth that stays put invites both protection and attack. The psychological burden is harder to see, but it is not imaginary. A farmer lives inside waiting for rain, waiting for germination, waiting for ripening, waiting for storage to hold, waiting for animals to give birth, waiting for pests not to arrive. The forager also waits and watches, but farming ties anticipation to sunk labour. If the crop fails, It is not only hunger that hurts, it is the memory of all the work that led to failure. The field can break the heart as well as the back. No bone records disappointment directly, but entire ritual systems later grow around the dread of failed rain and ruined harvests. That dread must have deep roots. Children are central to the agricultural bargain. Farming societies often support higher fertility than mobile foraging societies. Sedentary life can shorten the spacing between births because mothers do not need to carry infants over long distances in the same way, and grain-based weaning foods may allow earlier weaning. More children mean more labour eventually, and in farming households that labour matters. But more children also mean more mouths, more disease transmission, and more pressure on women's bodies. Pregnancy, nursing, food processing, field labour and childcare can overlap relentlessly. Population grows, and from the perspective of history this looks like success. From the perspective of a tired mother in a smoky house grinding grain while another child cries, success may feel different. Class and inequality deepen the bodily story. Once surplus can be stored and controlled, not everyone eats the same food or performs the same labour. Some people may gain access to better diets, lighter work, safer houses, ritual authority, or protection. Others may do the grinding, digging, hauling, and carrying. In later farming societies, elites can become physically distinct through diet and burial treatment, though this process takes different forms in different regions. The important point is that agriculture allows suffering to be distributed unevenly. Hunger can exist beside surplus. Hard labour can support leisure for others. The bodies in the ground begin to show not just adaptation, but hierarchy. There are surprises in the evidence too. Some early farmers care carefully for injured or disabled individuals, proving that harsh lives do not mean loveless lives. Skeletons sometimes show people surviving serious injury, disease, or impairment long enough that they must have received support. Settled life may even make certain kinds of care easier. A person who cannot travel far may still contribute to household tasks, craft, childcare, memory, or ritual. The village that spreads disease can also sustain dependence. The agricultural world is never only cruel, it is tangled. It produces new suffering and new forms of care together. Nor should the older foraging life be turned into a fantasy of perfect health. Foragers can suffer broken bones, parasites, violence, hunger, worn teeth, and high infant mortality. Some environments are brutally difficult. Climate shocks can devastate mobile people too. The comparison is not between paradise and disaster. It is between different risk systems. Foragers often distribute risk through mobility, diversity, sharing, and knowledge of broad landscapes. Farmers concentrate risk in fields, stores, herds, and settlements, then build new institutions to manage that concentration. Those institutions become increasingly powerful as the centuries pass. The deeper irony is that agriculture may succeed partly because it accepts worse conditions for individuals in exchange for greater reproductive output. A farming village can produce more surviving children over time, even if many are undernourished, sick, or heavily worked. Numbers matter in human history. More people can clear more fields, defend more land, absorb losses, and expand into neighbouring territories. A way of life does not have to make each person healthier to spread. It only has to reproduce itself effectively. This is one of the coldest lessons of the agricultural revolution, and one of the most important. By the time the first farming communities become established, the human body has become a ledger of the new economy. Teeth record starch and grit, bones record labour, stature records childhood stress, lesions record infection, trauma records conflict, burials record care, rank and belonging. The field feeds the village, but the village writes its costs into flesh. In later centuries, people will look at the achievements of agriculture and see civilization rising, but they will see walls, shrines, pottery, trade, writing, law, and cities. But beneath those achievements lies the quieter archive of bodies that paid for them one harvest at a time. Surplus begins as a comfort and becomes a force. A little stored food means a family can survive a lean month. A larger store means a village can endure winter, host a feast, feed guests, support a craftsperson, survive a failed hunt, or plant again after a bad year. But when food can be accumulated, guarded, counted, and distributed, it becomes more than food. It becomes authority waiting for a human shape. The granary is one of the most important inventions in history, not because it is dramatic, but because it changes the question at the centre of society. Instead of only asking where food can be found today, people must ask who controls what has been saved for tomorrow. At first, that control may remain household-based. A family stores its own grain in pits, baskets, jars, bins, or rooms. Kin groups share labour and claims. Elders remember who contributed what. But storage has a way of inviting management. Someone must decide how much seed is saved for planting and how much can be eaten. Someone must protect the store from pests, damp, thieves, and desperate neighbours. Someone must organise repair, harvest timing, and redistribution when scarcity comes. In a small community, these decisions can be made through custom, reputation, and negotiation. As villages grow, the same decisions become heavier. The stored harvest begins to create offices before anyone calls them offices. Surplus also makes specialisation possible. A person who does not spend every day finding food can make finer tools, shape pottery, weave cloth, build walls, carve stone, organise rituals, trade between settlements, or learn the complicated knowledge of healing, calendars, animals, and materials. This is one of agriculture's genuine upgrades. It frees some human time from immediate subsistence and concentrates skill. The potter can become better at pottery because others produce enough food to support that work. The builder can experiment. The ritual specialist can spend more time on ceremonies. The trader can travel with goods rather than merely with personal belongings. The result is a richer material world, filled with objects that would be difficult to produce in a highly mobile life. But specialization is never neutral. If some people are freed from food production, others must produce the food that frees them. A beautiful bowl may carry the hidden labor of farmers, grinders, fuel gatherers, and herders. A shrine may stand on the strength of harvests brought in by many hands. At first, exchange may be reciprocal and flexible. Over time, it can harden. Those who organize ritual, defense, storage, or trade can begin to claim a larger share. They may justify this through skill, ancestry, divine favor, protection, generosity, or control of sacred knowledge. Scholars still debate exactly how early hierarchy formed in different regions, but surplus gives ambition something durable to hold. Feasting becomes one of the bridges between generosity and power. A person who can feed many people does not simply fill stomachs. They create memory. They create obligation. They display access to labor, land, animals, grain, drink, and social connections. The feast may look communal, and often it is genuinely joyful, but it can also be political. To eat someone's food may mean entering their circle. To accept repeated generosity may mean owing support later. In this way, surplus can turn into prestige without looking like domination at first. Power often begins by serving a meal. The storage of grain also makes counting more important. A herd can be counted, jars can be counted, baskets, fields, measures, workers, days, debts, and rations can be counted. Long before writing becomes literature, it serves administration. Clay tokens, seals, tallies, marks, and eventually script emerge from the need to track goods and obligations in some early complex societies. This is one of the quieter ironies of civilization writing, one of humanity's most celebrated achievements. May have grown partly from accounting. The first marks are not necessarily poems, myths, or royal histories. They are often records of quantities, commodities, and control. The written word rises near the granary. Surplus also changes leadership. In mobile foraging societies, leaders often depend on persuasion, generosity, skill, or situational authority. A great hunter, healer, elder, or mediator may be respected. But permanent coercive power can be difficult to maintain when people can leave. Settled farming changes that balance. Leaving becomes harder. Land, houses, fields, stores, and ancestors hold people in place. Leaders who control storage, ritual centers, irrigation, defense, or exchange networks gain leverage that does not vanish at the end of a hunt. Their authority can become attached to institutions rather than personal skill alone. The village begins to create offices that survive the individual. This does not happen everywhere in the same way, and it does not happen peacefully as a simple march upward. Some early farming villages remain relatively egalitarian for long periods. Some show signs of communal storage rather than elite control. Some resist hierarchy or reorganize after tension. The evidence remains incomplete, and archaeologists must be careful not to read later kings back into every early granary. Still, the direction in many regions is clear enough. Where surplus accumulates and populations grow, social differences often become more durable. Wealth can be stored, status can be inherited, labor can be commanded, debt can be remembered beyond a single season. Debt is one of surplus's shadow forms. A family that loses its crop may borrow grain from another. A household short on seed may depend on a richer neighbor. A bride wealth exchange, funeral obligation, feast contribution, or failed harvest can create imbalance. In a world of stored food, debt is not only moral, it is material, it can be measured, it can grow, it can attach to families, it can become labor owed, land lost, children pledged, or loyalty demanded. Later written records from ancient states show debt as a major force in social life, but its roots likely reach into much older practices of obligation around food and labor. The first debt may have been remembered in the stomach before it was written on clay. Surplus also invites violence in more organized forms. Stored food can feed raiders, defenders, and eventually soldiers. A community with grain reserves can support people who specialize in fighting or guarding. Fortifications become more useful when there is something inside worth taking. Raiding does not begin with farming, but farming gives raiding a new target. It also gives defenders a reason to hold ground. Land becomes more than territory crossed or seasonally used. It becomes an investment, a field cleared by ancestors, watered by channels, enriched by dung, and planted with seed is not easily abandoned. Conflict over such land can become persistent, inherited, and deadly. At the same time, surplus encourages trade. No village has everything. Obsidian, shells, salt, fine stone, pigments, metals, timber, fibers, livestock, pottery, and rare foods move through exchange networks. Some of these materials travel astonishing distances long before empires. Obsidian, because its chemical signature can often be traced to its volcanic source, reveals networks connecting communities across mountains and plains. Shells appear far inland. Stones from distant quarries become blades, beads, or symbols. Trade spreads goods, but it also spreads ideas, crops, animals, technologies, styles, diseases, and ambitions. The village is settled, but its surplus reaches outward. Ritual centres may grow from this world of surplus, coordination, and meaning. People who farm do not only need calories, they need explanations for rain, drought, fertility, death, birth, and disaster. They need ceremonies that bind large groups together, especially when communities become too big for everyone to know everyone intimately. Shared ritual can make cooperation feel natural. It can also legitimate authority, a person or lineage associated with ancestors, spirits, calendars. Or sacred places may gain influence over labour and food. Temples in later agricultural societies often become economic institutions as well as religious ones, storing grain, managing land, employing workers, and redistributing goods. The sacred and the practical grow from the same soil. The surprising detail is how often power hides inside care. A central storehouse can protect a community from famine. A leader can coordinate irrigation, settle disputes, organise defence, and sponsor feasts. A ritual specialist can reduce fear by giving disaster a meaning. These roles may begin as useful services, but useful services can become monopolies. The person who guards the grain can decide who eats. The person who reads the calendar can decide when labour begins. The person who speaks for ancestors can decide what the ancestors demand. No single explanation fully accounts for the rise of hierarchy, but surplus makes it possible for help and domination to grow from the same root. In this sense, the granary is more revolutionary than the throne. The throne comes later, visible and decorated. The granary is older, quieter, and more fundamental. It teaches people to measure life in stored units. It creates the need for guards, managers, calendars, seals, and rules. It allows some people to stop farming and become artisans, priests, traders, warriors, administrators, or rulers. It makes generosity grander and inequality sharper. It turns hunger into something that can be postponed, but also controlled. By the time surplus becomes central to settled life, the agricultural mistake has deepened into an agricultural system. The field feeds the storehouse feeds specialists. Specialists build new tools, rituals, defences, and claims. Claims become traditions, traditions become rights, rights become hierarchies. None of this is inevitable in every village, and many communities find ways to share, resist, or limit power. But the possibility is now present in a way it was not before. Food no longer vanishes when eaten or spoils quickly after gathering. It waits, and because it waits, people wait around it hoping, guarding, arguing, counting, worshipping, and obeying. Civilization begins not only when humans learn to grow more food, but when food learns how to rule humans through the hands of other humans. Fields demand obedience in a way forests, rivers, and open plains do not. A forager must obey nature too, but the obedience is mobile and interpretive. If berries fail in one valley, another food may be found elsewhere. If animals move, people may follow or turn to fish, roots, nuts, shellfish, or trade. The landscape gives commands, but they are many commands at once, and skilled people answer by shifting attention. A field is different. Once planted, it becomes a fixed promise. It cannot follow the rain, it cannot flee insects, it cannot move away from conflict, it waits where it is, and because it waits, the people who depend on it must also remain within reach. Farming turns survival into a schedule tied to one piece of ground. This is one of the least visible but most profound changes in human history. Agriculture transforms time. The year becomes sharper, less forgiving. There is a time to prepare soil, a time to sow, a time to weed, a time to guard, a time to harvest, a time to thresh, a time to grind, a time to store, a time to repair tools, a time to maintain walls, a time to breed animals, a time to move herds, a time to dig channels, a time to clear brush, and a time to begin again. Foragers know seasons intimately, but farmers must bind labour to them with a new intensity. Missing the right moment can mean hunger months later. A delayed planting is not merely inconvenient, it can echo through the entire year. Calendars become more than memory aids, they become instruments of survival and coordination. Long before formal written calendars, farming communities watched the sky, the behaviour of animals, the swelling of buds, the arrival of rains, the height of rivers, the return of birds, and the position of stars. These signs matter because the crop must be synchronised with forces beyond human control. Later, civilizations will turn this attention into astronomy, ritual calendars, priestly authority, and state scheduling, but the root is older and more practical. The field teaches people to measure time because hunger punishes those who measure badly. Scholars still debate how much early ritual architecture was tied to calendars, seasonal gatherings, or cosmology, but it's clear that settled agricultural life gives the heavens a new administrative importance. The daily rhythm changes too. Farming does not mean constant frantic work every hour of every day, and there are seasonal lulls, festivals, and social gatherings, but it creates recurring labour that cannot be postponed indefinitely. Weeds grow whether people are tired or not, animals need water whether a household is grieving or celebrating, grain must be protected from damp and pests, fences collapse, irrigation channels silt up, roofs leak, tools break, fuel runs low, Dung must be managed. The farm is a living machine that begins to decay the moment attention slips. This is the origin of a kind of time that feels familiar even now, the endless maintenance of a human-made world. Boundaries become sharper under agriculture. A mobile group may know territories, routes, sacred places, hunting grounds, gathering zones, and seasonal rights. So it would be wrong to imagine foragers as people without place or claim. But farming makes boundaries heavier because labour has been invested in specific ground. A cleared field is not just land, it is work made visible. A terrace is work hardened into stone. An irrigation channel is work stretched across a landscape. A garden is work returning each season. When people improve land, they tend to claim it more strongly. When they claim it, they defend it. When they defend it, they remember who belongs and who does not. Inheritance follows closely behind. If a family clears a plot, plants trees, builds a house, digs storage pits, and buries ancestors beneath the floor, the next generation inherits more than stories. It inherits material claims. Land becomes a bridge between the dead and the unborn. This can stabilise communities, but it can also freeze inequality. A child born into a household with good fields, animals, tools, and stored grain enters a different world from a child born into a household with little. The old inequalities of skill, luck, kinship, and reputation become attached to things that last. Agriculture gives the past more power over the future. Property is never simple in early societies. Land may belong to households, lineages, villages, temples, chiefs, or overlapping systems of use. A field may be worked by one family but subject to communal rules. Pasture may be shared seasonally. Water may be managed through custom. The evidence remains incomplete, especially before writing, so it is dangerous to impose modern ownership too neatly. Still, agriculture makes property more durable and more contested. The field is visible, bounded, improved, and necessary. That combination invites rules. Rules invite enforcement. Enforcement invites authority. The body learns this new order through repetition. Paths from house to field become worn by feet. Hands learn the weight of a hoe, sickle, digging stick, basket, rope, and jar. Children learn where they may go and where they may not. Animals learn fences, tethers, calls, and routes to water. Even the soil becomes part of a disciplined system, opened, seeded, weeded, watered, manured, drained, or rested according to human intention. Yet the soil also resists. It compacts. It erodes. It loses fertility. It grows weeds. It cracks in drought and turns heavy in rain. Farming is often described as control over nature, but to the farmer it is just as often negotiation with stubborn matter. The obedience demanded by fields extends into social life. Harvesting must often be done quickly, especially when grain ripens all at once or weather threatens. This encourages group labour. Families help one another. Villagers coordinate. Leaders or elders may call work parties. Feasts may reward cooperation. Songs, rituals, and customs may make labour bearable and meaningful. But coordination also means pressure. A person who refuses to help at the crucial moment may endanger others or lose support later. Agricultural time becomes moral time. There are good workers and lazy ones, responsible households and unreliable ones, generous kin and selfish neighbours. The field judges character through labour. Water intensifies this pattern. Rain-fed farming is already demanding, but irrigation creates a stronger form of dependence. Channels, ditches, levees, basins, and gates must be built and maintained. Water must be allocated. Upstream users can harm downstream users. Silt must be cleared. Floods can nourish or destroy. In places such as Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Indus region, parts of China, Mesoamerica, and the Andes, water management becomes central to later complex societies. Though each region develops in its own way, it is tempting to imagine irrigation automatically producing centralized states. But scholars still debate that old theory. Small communities can manage water effectively, and states can arise for many reasons. Still, irrigation clearly favours coordination, record-keeping, authority, and conflict. Because water is life moving through a channel someone must control. Animals impose their own calendars. Herds must be bred, milked, moved, guarded, sheared, slaughtered, or exchanged at the right time. Lambing and kidding seasons shape household labour. Pasture must recover. Drought can force movement. Disease can sweep through animals as well as humans. A herd seems mobile compared with a field, but it is a moving obligation. It ties people to routes, water points, neighbours, predators, and seasonal knowledge. Pastoralists may look freer than the farmer, yet the animals set the pace. Domestication replaces one kind of wild uncertainty with another kind of managed dependence. This new discipline seeps into thought. Farming encourages people to imagine life as improvement through labour. Clear the field, plant the seed, guard the crop, enlarge the herd, repair the wall, fill the store, build for descendants. The future becomes something produced by work. That idea can be empowering. It allows planning on a scale earlier people may not have needed. It allows houses to become lineages, paths to become roads, gardens to become estates, shrines to become temples. But it also creates a harsh moral shadow. If work is supposed to secure the future, then failure can seem like someone's fault, even when drought, flood, pests, disease, or bad luck are responsible. Farming societies often struggle to explain catastrophe because so much effort has already been invested in preventing it. There is also the discipline of waiting. A seed in the ground cannot be hurried by hunger. A calf cannot become an ox overnight. A tree crop may require years. Fermentation, drying, curing, aging, breeding, and fallowing all teach delayed reward. Human beings were capable of patience long before agriculture, but farming institutionalizes patience. It ties communities to cycles longer than immediate appetite. This can produce wisdom, restraint, and continuity. It can also produce anxiety, because the reward is always vulnerable until it is safely stored, and even storage is not truly safe. The surprising detail is that agriculture may have helped create a new relationship with boredom. Mobile foraging life includes waiting, rest, and repeated tasks, but farming multiplies monotonous labour-weeding roos, grinding grain, carrying water, watching animals, patching walls, scraping hides, twisting fibres, collecting fuel, clearing silt. These tasks are not dramatic, yet they occupy enormous portions of human life. Civilization is built not only on invention and ambition, but on tolerated repetition. The monuments of the ancient world stand on a foundation of people doing necessary things again and again until their names disappear. Still, obedience is not the same as misery. Agricultural schedules also create festivals, harvest celebrations, communal meals, rites of planting and renewal, songs of work, and seasons of rest. The same calendar that disciplines labour can organise joy. The same harvest that demands sweat can end in abundance. People do not live inside systems only as victims. They decorate them, sing through them, joke about them, ritualise them, and find dignity in doing difficult work well. What survives in the record suggests both burden and belonging. A field can be a prison, but it can also be home. The deeper transformation is that freedom itself changes meaning. In a mobile world, freedom may mean the ability to move, to shift strategies, to leave conflict, to follow abundance. In a farming world, freedom may mean secure access to land, seed, water, animals, and stored food. It may mean protection from raiders, fair distribution of irrigation, reliable inheritance, and freedom from crushing debt. The farmer is not simply less free than the forager. The farmer is free or unfree within a different architecture of dependence. But that architecture is heavier. It is built from houses, fields, graves, boundaries, tools, and obligations that do not move easily. By the time agriculture takes deep root, humans are living inside a new kind of time. The open rhythm of seasonal movement has narrowed into the disciplined circle of production. The year returns, but it returns with tasks attached. The field remembers neglect. The herd remembers absence. The storehouse remembers counting. The boundary remembers conflict. The ancestor beneath the floor remembers belonging. Farming gives humanity the power to build durable worlds, and then makes those worlds demand maintenance. This is one of the reasons the upgrade becomes so difficult to escape. Once people build their lives around the field begins to build their lives around itself. Women stand at the centre of the agricultural revolution, though the oldest stories of civilization often push them toward the edge. The field, the hearth, the storage jar, the grinding stone, the birth mat, the water path, the fuel bundle, the loom, the animal pen, and the sleeping child all belong to the same world of work, and much of that work falls on women in many farming societies. The exact pattern is never universal. Gender roles differ across time, region, ecology, and social organisation, and scholars still debate how far any single model can be applied to the deep past, but the evidence is clear enough to show that agriculture reshapes family life with enormous force. It changes how many children are born, how households organise labour, how food is processed, how property moves through generations, and how the burdens of survival are divided. In mobile foraging societies, birth spacing often tends to be wider, partly because mothers must carry infants and young children over long distances, and partly because breastfeeding patterns can delay the return of fertility. This is not a fixed law, but it is a powerful tendency. Farming changes the conditions. Settled life allows families to remain in one place. Grain porridges, milk in some societies, and other soft foods can help wean children earlier. More children can survive on stored staples. More hands can eventually help with fields, animals, fuel, water, and domestic tasks. The result is one of agriculture's most consequential effects. Fertility rises, population grows, the village fills. From the perspective of history, this looks like strength. From the perspective of women's bodies, it can mean repeated pregnancy, nursing, recovery, and work without long pauses. A farming household needs labour, and children are both loved persons and future workers. The agricultural family becomes a production unit in a sharper way than before. A child can scare birds from crops, gather dung, carry small bundles, watch goats, fetch water, help grind grain, mind younger siblings, or weed close to the house. This does not mean children are valued only as labour, but it does mean their labour becomes woven into survival early. Farming makes large families useful, and usefulness becomes part of the reproductive engine that pushes agricultural societies outward. The grinding stone again returns, almost like a silent character in the story. It sits near the hearth, near the place where raw harvest becomes edible food. In many early farming communities, processing grain likely takes hours each day. The movement is repetitive, physically demanding, and easy to underestimate because it does not look like conquest, hunting, or monument building, yet without it, the village does not eat. The bones of women in some early agricultural populations show patterns of heavy repetitive labour, though interpretation must be cautious. What survives in the record suggests that the work of turning crops into meals was one of the great hidden engines of civilization. Bread, porridge, beer, and stored flour all begin with hands wearing down grain and being worn down in return. Water and fuel add to the burden. Settled life requires daily carrying. Water must come from springs, wells, rivers, streams, or storage. Fuel must be gathered from woodland, brush, reeds, dung, crop waste, or trade. As nearby resources shrink, the distance may grow. A household's need for cooked food, warmth, pottery, plaster, and animal care turns the surrounding landscape into a circle of repeated journeys. These tasks are often gendered in farming societies. And when they fall heavily on women, the working day stretches around the visible agricultural calendar. The field may have seasons, but domestic labour has no harvest festival where it ends. Agriculture also changes marriage and kinship. When land, houses, animals, seed stores, and tools become valuable, marriage becomes tied more tightly to property and labour. Families may arrange unions to secure fields, exchange livestock, strengthen alliances, or manage inheritance, bride wealth, dowry, and other forms of exchange vary widely. But the underlying pattern is clear: farming makes household formation economically weighty. A marriage is not only a relationship between two people. It can be a transfer of labour, fertility, land rights, animals, obligations, and future descendants. The evidence remains incomplete for the earliest communities, but later agricultural societies show how strongly marriage can become entangled with production and inheritance. Inheritance itself can alter gender relations. In some farming societies, descent and property pass through male lines. In others, women retain important rights. Land passes through female lines, or residence patterns give women strong local support. There is no single agricultural gender system, but plough agriculture in particular has often been linked by scholars to stronger male control in many regions, partly because ploughing with large animals tends to be physically demanding. Tied to land ownership and associated with male labour in numerous historical societies, hoe farming, horticulture, and garden systems can support different gender balances. This remains debated and varies greatly, but the larger point is that the tools of farming help shape the social meaning of bodies. The plough deserves special attention because it is not just a tool, it is a social event. Early agriculture can be done with digging sticks, hoes, fire, and hand labour. Ploughs, especially when pulled by oxen, allow heavier soils to be opened and larger areas to be cultivated. They increase production, but they also favour households with access to animals, equipment, and enough labour to maintain them. The plough can deepen inequality between households and may shift prestige toward those who control animal traction. It changes fields, bodies, and gendered expectations. A simple line cut through soil can also cut through society. Women's work is not confined to labour alone. In many early communities, women may have been central to seed selection, plant knowledge, food preparation, textile production, childcare, healing, and ritual life. The domestication of plants may have depended heavily on the observations of gatherers who knew which seeds, fruits, roots, and fibres mattered. It is often impossible to identify individuals in the archaeological record, and assigning invention by gender can become speculative. Still, it would be absurd to imagine agriculture emerging without the knowledge of those who handled plants daily. The agricultural revolution is not the story of a lone male inventor with a plough. It is a slow accumulation of household intelligence, much of it probably held in women's hands. Textiles reveal another hidden revolution. Farming and herding provide flax, cotton in some regions, wool from sheep, and other fibres that can be spun, woven, and stored. Textile production is labour-intensive and often archaeologically invisible because fibres decay, yet cloth changes everything. It makes clothing, bags, nets, sails, bedding, wrappings, trade goods, and status display possible on new scales. Spinning and weaving can occupy vast amounts of time, and in many later agricultural societies they become heavily associated with women. A piece of cloth may look soft and domestic, but it contains hours of disciplined labour. Like grain, it is stored work. Fertility becomes both biological and symbolic. Farming societies often develop powerful imagery around birth, earth, crops, animals, and renewal. Archaeologists have found figurines, decorated spaces, and symbolic objects that some interpret as fertility-related, though caution is necessary. Not every female figurine is a goddess. Not every rounded form is a fertility cult. Popular theories often overstate what can be known. Still, the connection between human reproduction and agricultural abundance is difficult to miss. Fields, wombs, seed, blood, milk, rain, and harvest become linked in human imagination because they are linked in survival. The household watches women's bodies and fields with the same anxious hope for continuation. That hope can become control. When population growth matters, women's fertility becomes a social concern, not only a personal one. Families, lineages, and communities may seek to regulate marriage, sexuality, childbirth, and inheritance more tightly. The more property and descent matter, the more societies may police legitimacy and women's movements. Again, This varies enormously, and no single explanation fully accounts for gender inequality across agricultural societies. But farming creates conditions in which control over reproduction and control over property can reinforce one another. The settled house protects, but it can also confine. The household itself becomes a world of hierarchy and cooperation. It contains elders, adults, children, in-laws, servants in some later cases, animals, stored food, tools, ancestors, and obligations. Authority may rest with older men, older women, couples, lineages, or communal rules depending on society. Inside the household, care and discipline are inseparable. Children are fed and trained. Animals are tended and slaughtered. Seed is saved and consumed. Food is shared and withheld. The household is tender, practical, and political. It is where the vast abstraction called agriculture becomes a morning of tasks. One lesser-known consequence of settled family life is the intensification of infectious disease among children. More siblings, closer houses, shared water, animals nearby, and accumulated waste all increase exposure. High fertility may partly compensate for high mortality, creating a demographic engine that feels cruelly wasteful. Many children are born because many are needed, and many are needed because many die, or because the labour demand never ends. No parent thinks in those cold terms while grieving a child, but population systems often operate through heartbreak. The growth of farming societies is built on both birth and loss. Yet within this hard world, there is affection, skill, pride, and identity. Women are not merely victims of agriculture, they are makers of it. They select seeds, prepare food, teach children, manage households, produce textiles, maintain social ties, heal, remember, mourn, and sometimes hold property or ritual authority. In some societies, women become traders, brewers, priestesses, landholders, or political actors. The record is uneven because later male-centered texts often distort the picture, and earlier archaeology speaks indirectly, but it is clear that civilization rests on labour that formal history long failed to name. The agricultural upgrade therefore transforms the family into one of humanity's most powerful institutions. It raises birth rates, anchors inheritance, organises labour, and ties reproduction to land. It also makes inequality more intimate. Power no longer appears only in chiefs, temples, or granaries. It appears in who eats first, who grinds the grain, who carries the water, who owns the animals, who inherits the field, who may leave the house, and who bears another child. The worst mistake is not simply that humans planted crops, it is that the success of crops made certain burdens seem natural, especially when those burdens were repeated every day by the people least likely to be remembered. By now the village is no longer just a cluster of houses beside fields. It is a machine of birth, labour, memory, property, and obligation. Children grow up inside its rhythms and learn them as normal. Women's bodies carry the demographic expansion that allows farming societies to spread. Men's roles shift too, toward fields, herds, defence, ploughing, exchange, or authority, depending on the place. The household becomes the hinge between biology and civilization, and as families multiply, stores expand, and leaders learn to count what others produce. The settled world begins to press towards something larger than the village. The same grain that fills a household jar can fill a temple granary. The same labour that feeds a family can be organised to build walls, canals, and monuments. The family farm is already connected to the future city, though no one standing at the grinding stone can yet see how far that road will go. Cities rise when the village becomes too large for memory alone. A small settlement can live by face, kinship, habit, and reputation. People know who planted, who harvested, who married, who failed to help, who shared food, who fought, who mourned, and who carries old grudges like stones in a pouch. But as settlements grow into towns and towns into cities, the human mind reaches a limit. Strangers appear inside the same social world. Food comes from fields no one in the centre can see. Goods move through hands whose names are forgotten. Debts outlive the people who first remembered them. Authority can no longer depend only on personal knowledge. The city needs systems, measures, seals, offices, rituals, roads, walls, laws, and eventually writing. Grain makes this possible because grain can be gathered from many fields, stored in bulk, rationed, counted, and commanded. The earliest cities are not just big villages, they are new kinds of organisms. They draw food from surrounding countryside and return demands, tools, protection, ceremonies, markets, and orders. They contain specialists who do not farm potters, weavers, builders, traders, priests, administrators, guards, metalworkers, boatmen, healers, and labourers whose work depends on surplus moving inward. A city is therefore a landscape of dependence hidden beneath a landscape of achievement, its walls. Temples, streets, platforms, drains, workshops, and marketplaces all rest on crops growing beyond the edge of sight. The urban miracle begins in the field but quickly learns to forget the field, at least until famine brings the memory back. In Mesopotamia, the land between and around the Tigris and Euphrates becomes one of the clearest examples of grain's power to build cities. Southern Mesopotamia is not naturally easy country. Rainfall is limited, heat can be severe, rivers shift, floods can nourish or destroy, and irrigation demands constant attention. Yet those difficulties become part of the engine. Irrigation allows large harvests, but irrigation also requires coordination. Channels must be dug, silt cleared. Embankments maintained, water allocated, disputes settled. Over time, temple households, administrators, and emerging elites become deeply involved in storing grain, organising labour, and tracking obligations. Writing appears in this world not first as a voice of poetry, but as a tool of management signs pressed into clay to record barley, animals, workers, beer, rations, and transactions. The first city does not merely speak, it counts. This is one of the great surprises of the human past. Writing, the technology that will one day preserve epics, prayers, love songs, royal boasts, medical recipes, astronomical observations, and private complaints, begins largely in the dust of administration. Clay tablets record quantities because quantities have become too important to trust to memory. A jar must be sealed, a delivery must be verified, a ration must be issued, a field must be assessed, a worker must be fed. A temple must know what it owns and what it is owed. The written sign is born near the storehouse, and from the start it carries both liberation and control. It allows knowledge to travel across time, but it also allows authority to harden into records that cannot be argued with easily. In Egypt, another agricultural world takes shape along the Nile. Here the river behaves differently from the Mesopotamian rivers. Its annual flood, though variable and sometimes disastrous, creates a long ribbon of fertility through desert. The contrast is almost theatrical black soil beside red land, fields pressed against sand, villages and tombs strung along a river that becomes both road and lifeline. Egyptian civilization grows from this predictable yet sacred rhythm. Flood, planting. Harvest, storage, taxation, and redistribution become the pulse of the state. The pharaoh's power is cosmic in language, but practical in grain. Temples, pyramids, administrators, scribes, soldiers, and craft specialists all depend on the ability to mobilize agricultural surplus from the valley. The pyramids make this visible in stone. They're often imagined through mystery, and popular speculation has surrounded them for centuries, but the mainstream evidence points not to lost machines or unsupported fantasies, but to organised labour, skilled engineering, administrative capacity, and a society able to feed workers on a huge scale. The real mystery is not whether humans could build them. Humans did. The deeper mystery is how farming societies learned to coordinate so much labour, material, belief, and food into a single project. Monumental architecture is surplus made visible. It is harvest transformed into limestone, mud brick, sweat, and authority. In the Indus region, cities such as Harappa and Mohenjo-daro reveal yet another agricultural urban world, one with baked brick architecture, planned streets, drainage systems, craft production, trade, and a still undeciphered script. The undeciphered writing is a reminder that cities can leave enormous traces and still keep their inner life partly hidden. We can see streets, wells, weights, seals, beads, and drains, but not hear the full language of law, myth, or argument. Scholars still debate the structure of India's political authority, because the evidence does not show kings and palaces in the same obvious way as Egypt or Mesopotamia. No single model fully explains it. What survives suggests a highly organised society, but not one that fits neatly into the familiar image of ruler, palace, and conquest. Agriculture supports the city, but the city's political soul remains partly out of reach. In China, early states emerge from farming worlds shaped by millet, rice, rivers, flood control, lineage, ritual, and bronze. Along the Yellow River and beyond, agricultural intensification supports larger settlements, craft specialization, warfare, and political authority. In the Yangtze Basin, rice agriculture offers another path toward dense communities. Floods and water management loom large. Later Chinese states will make grain, labor, ancestor ritual, writing, and bureaucracy central to political life. Here too, farming does not merely feed civilization. It gives civilization its habits, record-keeping, hierarchy, land claims, taxation, storage, seasonal labor, and the belief that order must be maintained against chaos. Across the ocean, in Mesoamerica and the Andes, urban and state traditions rise from crops unknown to the Old World maize, beans, squash, chili, amaranth, potatoes, quinoa, manioc in broader American contexts, and many others. Maize in particular becomes a foundation for powerful societies, but its domestication from teosinte is a long and remarkable transformation. The wild ancestor looks so unlike a modern maize cob that the change seems almost improbable at first glance. Human selection gradually turns small, hard seed cases into a crop capable of feeding villages, cities, and states. In the Andes, potatoes and other highland crops, along with camelids such as llamas and alpacas, support societies adapted to vertical landscapes where altitude creates ecological tiers. Here farming is not flat fields stretching to the horizon, it is terraces, slopes, storage, frost management, herding, and roads across mountains. Civilization does not require one kind of farm. It requires reliable surplus fitted to a landscape. Cities intensify inequality because they concentrate people who live very different lives. Some command labour, some record it, some perform rituals that justify the order, some craft luxury goods, some carry bricks, some clean drains, some grind grain in bulk, some guard gates, Some live near sacred or administrative centres, while others crowd into ordinary houses. The city magnifies difference because it must organise difference. A village may contain inequality. But a city institutionalises it. Rank becomes architecture. Power gains doors, courtyards, platforms, restricted spaces, official seals, and guards. Law grows from this density. When strangers trade, when fields are taxed, when debts are recorded, when marriages transfer property, when labour is owed, when theft threatens stores, when irrigation disputes can ruin crops, custom must become more formal. Written laws in later ancient societies reveal a world deeply concerned with land, debt, wages, injury, marriage, inheritance, slaves, animals, and property. Law is often praised as civilization's triumph over violence, and it can be that. But law can also preserve hierarchy, define punishment unequally, and protect those who already hold power. Like grain, law is both upgrade and instrument. Organised violence grows beside organised administration. Farming supports population density, and population density supports armies. Stored grain feeds soldiers. States can conscript labour, build fortifications, supply campaigns, and reward loyalty with land or goods. War becomes larger and more durable when institutions can sustain it. This does not mean farmers invented violence, but farming societies scale it upward. A raid becomes a campaign, a feud becomes a border war. A defensive wall becomes a state frontier. The same administrative skill that stores barley can distribute rations to men carrying weapons. Yet cities are not only machines of power, they are also places of astonishing creativity. In them, people encounter strangers, materials, ideas, gods, stories, measurements, recipes, tools, and styles from beyond their home ground. The city accelerates invention because it brings specialists together. It creates markets where goods and rumours travel. It creates schools for scribes, workshops for artisans, temples for ritual, and archives for memory. The urban world gives humanity new forms of beauty-carved seals, painted pottery, woven cloth, metalwork, monumental buildings, mathematical systems, calendars, hymns, myths, and maps of obligation that stretch far beyond one village. The worst mistake has by now produced wonders no foraging world, however rich, was likely to produce in the same form. This is the central contradiction sharpened to its highest edge. Farming makes the city possible, and the city makes civilization visible. It gives humanity writing, architecture, law, specialized knowledge, long-distance trade, and institutions that can outlive individuals. It also gives humanity taxation, bureaucracy, class stratification, organized warfare, forced labor, mass disease, and rulers who can turn other people's harvest into monuments to themselves. The city is not the opposite of the field. It is the field's most elaborate consequence. By the time grain reaches the urban storehouse, the original act of planting has travelled far beyond hunger. A seed becomes a ration becomes a wage becomes a labour gang becomes a wall, a canal, a temple, a tomb, a palace, a road, a battlefield. The field outside the city still waits for rain and labour, but inside the city that harvest becomes numbers, offices, ceremonies, and commands. Humanity has upgraded itself into a species capable of building worlds larger than kinship, larger than memory, larger than any one life. And the price is that people now live under systems so vast that many can no longer see the field of power in which they stand. The landscape fights back slowly at first. A field does not announce its exhaustion in a single dramatic moment. It gives a little less. The soil thins. The water drains poorly. The harvest seems smaller, then smaller again. A hillside that once held roots begins to lose itself in rain. A channel that once carried life-giving water brings salt. A forest edge retreats beyond the distance of an easy walk. A grazing slope turns bare under too many hooves. Farming begins with the promise that humans can make the land more predictable. But the land has its own memory, and it records every cut tree, every ploughed surface, every diverted stream, every herd pressed too long against the same ground. The first farmers do not understand ecology in modern terms, but they understand consequences. They know when soil tires, they know when water stands too long, they know when pests return, they know when fire clears too much or too little, they know when goats strip young growth before woodland can recover, yet knowledge does not always prevent pressure. A growing village needs fuel, fields, pasture, roof beams, baskets, tools, fences, pottery, plaster, and cooking fires. A town needs more. A city needs more still. The appetite of settled life spreads outward in rings, turning the surrounding landscape into a supply zone. What looks like local survival becomes environmental transformation. Deforestation is one of agriculture's earliest shadows. Trees fall for fields, houses, fuel, boats, charcoal, lime plaster, metalworking, and daily cooking. In some regions, forests regenerate if land is rested, or populations remain small. In others, repeated cutting, browsing animals, and expanding fields prevent recovery. Without tree cover, rain strikes soil more directly, slopes erode, streams carry silt, floods can become more destructive. The loss is not always immediate enough to frighten people into stopping. That is part of the danger. Agricultural damage often moves at the speed of generations. and each generation inherits a landscape already altered enough to seem normal. Erosion is civilization losing its foundation grain by grain. A ploughed hillside can produce well for a time, especially after forest is cleared and nutrients are released, but exposed soil is vulnerable. Rain takes it, wind takes it, hooves break it, irrigation shifts it. Once topsoil is gone, no command from a ruler can bring it back quickly. Terraces, walls, fallowing, manuring, crop rotation, and careful water management can slow the loss. And many farming societies develop impressive conservation techniques. But when population, taxation, debt, or elite demand pushes production too hard, the land pays first, and people pay later. Irrigation brings a different kind of danger. Water is life, but water is never just water. It carries minerals. In hot, dry landscapes, irrigation water can evaporate from fields and leave salts behind. If drainage is poor, salt accumulates in the soil until crops struggle or fail. This process, salinization, is one of the most important hidden enemies of ancient agriculture, especially in parts of Mesopotamia. Farmers may shift crops, abandon fields, dig drains, or move cultivation. But the problem can become severe over time. Barley tolerates salt better than wheat, and shifts toward barley in some ancient records have been interpreted as evidence of worsening soil salinity. Though scholars still debate the scale, timing, and local causes, the larger point remains clear: the technology that makes farming possible in dry lands can also poison the land that depends on it. Rivers are powerful allies and unreliable servants. The Nile's flood can renew fields with silt, but a flood too low brings hunger, and a flood too high brings destruction. The Tigris and Euphrates can irrigate plains, but they can also shift, silt channels, break banks, and require relentless labour. The Indus system supports vast settlements, yet changing river courses and monsoon patterns may have contributed to urban transformation and decline. Though no single explanation fully accounts for what happened. In China, the Yellow River is both cradle and threat, carrying enormous loads of silt and earning a reputation in later history for catastrophic floods. Farming near rivers is an act of trust in a force that has no loyalty. Pests flourish in the simplified world humans create. A wild landscape is varied, patchy, and difficult for any one eater to dominate for long. A field is a concentration of similar plants, growing at the same time, often in dense stands, for insects, birds, rodents, fungi, and plant diseases. This can be a feast laid out with remarkable efficiency. Farmers respond with timing, storage methods, smoke, cats, traps, dogs, scare devices, crop diversity, ritual, and constant vigilance. But pests are not accidents at the edge of agriculture. They are part of the system. Every harvest invites other species to harvest too. Weeds are equally persistent. They are not enemies in any moral sense. They are opportunists adapted to disturbance, and farming is organised disturbance. Every cleared patch of ground invites plants that grow fast, spread easily, and exploit open soil. Weeding becomes one of the endless labours of agriculture because the field is never truly finished. It must be defended against the landscape's attempt to become something else. A farm is not nature conquered, it is nature interrupted. An interruption requires maintenance. Animals add another layer. Livestock can enrich soil with manure, pull ploughs, provide milk, meat, wool, hides, and status. But too many animals can destroy vegetation, compact soil, spread disease, and intensify erosion. Goats are especially famous for their ability to browse young trees and shrubs, though they are often blamed too simply for complex human decisions. Overgrazing is rarely the fault of animals alone. It is the result of herd size, land rights, climate stress, market demand. Social competition and survival need. A household may know that a slope is being damaged and still graze it because the alternative is losing animals that represent food, wealth, and future security. Climate does not stop changing just because people plant fields. Droughts, cold snaps, flood cycles, monsoon shifts, volcanic eruptions, and long-term climate fluctuations all continue to shape human history. Farming can buffer some of these shocks through storage and irrigation, but it can also make societies more vulnerable when they become too dependent on narrow systems. A foraging group facing local drought may move if neighbouring lands are open, a city dependent on canals, fields. And taxes cannot simply pick itself up and walk away. The very complexity that makes it powerful makes it brittle. One of the surprising details is that some ancient environmental damage was recognised and managed with real skill. Terracing in mountain regions, raised fields and wetlands, irrigation scheduling, manure use, mixed cropping, flood recession farming, forest management, and crop rotation all show that farming communities were not ignorant destroyers of land. Many understood their environments intimately and created sustainable systems that lasted centuries. The mistake was not farming as simple stupidity. The mistake was that farming made it possible to exceed limits while hiding the cost until the system had grown dependent on excess. States can make the problem worse. A village farming for itself may adjust to local conditions. A state demanding taxes, rents, tribute, or grain quotas may force production beyond what land can bear. Officials count harvests, not soil organisms. Armies need rations, temples need offerings, cities need bread, elites need surplus to display power. When the command comes from far away, the field becomes an extraction zone. The farmer knows the land is tired, but the collector may only know the measure owed. This separation between ecological knowledge and political demand is one of civilization's oldest dangers. The land also fights back through disease environments. Irrigation canals and standing water can support mosquitoes and parasites. Dense settlements alter waste flows. Domesticated animals reshape pathogen landscapes. Malnutrition from crop failure weakens immune systems. Environmental stress and human health become intertwined. A bad harvest is not only hunger, it can become epidemic vulnerability, migration, conflict, and social unrest. The field, the body, and the state are now connected in one fragile system. Still, collapse is rarely caused by environment alone. This matters. It is tempting to tell simple stories in which forests vanish and civilizations fall, or drought arrives and cities empty. Reality is usually messier. Environmental stress interacts with politics, trade, inequality, warfare, migration, belief, disease, and decision-making. The evidence remains incomplete in many cases, and scholars still debate the role of climate or land degradation in particular ancient collapses. But the pattern is strong enough to haunt the agricultural story. Farming societies transform their environments, and transformed environments eventually transform those societies back. By now, the old promise of agriculture has become more complicated. The field gives food, but asks for forest. The canal gives water, but risks salt. The herd gives wealth, but can strip the slope. The granary gives security, but invites pests and power. The city gives brilliance, but requires a countryside large enough to feed its hunger. Each solution creates a new problem that must be solved by another layer of labour, organisation, or expansion. Agriculture does not end uncertainty. It converts uncertainty into management. The landscape's resistance is not vengeance. Soil, rivers, insects, forests, and climate are not moral judges. They simply respond, remove cover, and soil moves, add water without drainage, and salt rises, store grain, and rodents come, crowd people and animals, and pathogens find paths, demand too much from land, and yield declines. Human beings build civilization by learning these responses, but they also suffer whenever ambition outruns attention. The first farmers could not see the full future hidden in their fields. They could not see eroded hillsides, salted plains, collapsed irrigation networks, abandoned villages, famine records, or cities searching farther and farther for timber and grain. But they could feel the beginning of the pattern. More mouths required more fields required more clearing. More clearing changed water, soil, fuel, and animals. The upgrade grew by making landscapes productive. And the mistake deepened whenever productivity was mistaken for control. So the land fights back not with a single blow, but with feedback. It answers human pressure in harvests, pests, floods, drought scars, salinity, empty woodlands, and tired soil. It reminds every farming society that food is never merely produced by people. It is negotiated with earth systems older than humanity itself, and as those negotiations become larger, more crowded, and more unequal, the consequences become harder to contain. The granary may still be full for now. The city may still rise, the ruler may still count the harvest, but beneath the field, in the water and soil, the next crisis may already be forming. Collapse often begins before anyone names it. The granary is lower than expected, but not empty. The river comes late, but still comes. The taxes are heavier, but somehow paid. A few families leave, then a few more. Walls are repaired with less care. Fields at the edge are abandoned first, because the best land must be protected. Burials become more hurried. Trade goods arrive less often. Stories circulate about raiders, sickness, failed rains, angry gods, corrupt officials, bad omens. Are people upstream taking too much water? Nothing has ended yet. Children are still born. Bread is still baked. Animals still cry in their pens before dawn. But the system has begun to spend its reserves, and a farming society can live for a long time on yesterday's strength before the break becomes visible. The granary is supposed to protect against hunger, and often it does. Stored food is one of the great defences of settled life. It allows a community to survive winter, drought, siege, flood, or crop failure. But storage also creates a dangerous illusion of the belief that shortage has been conquered. A full granary can hide a weakening field, a shrinking labour force, a corrupt administration, a changing climate, or a population already too large for the next bad year. When the stored harvest is gone, the truth arrives quickly. Farming societies are not fragile because they lack planning. They are fragile because their planning depends on many things continuing to work at once. Famine is rarely just the absence of food, it is the failure of a whole system of access. Some people may starve while grain still exists nearby, locked in elite storehouses, temple reserves, merchant storage, army supplies, or households with enough power to protect what they have. This is one of agriculture's darkest consequences. Hunger becomes political. In a foraging crisis, scarcity can be brutal, but in a farming state, scarcity can coexist with inequality so sharp that survival depends on rank, debt, location, and obedience. Later written records from ancient societies often show rulers worrying about famine, temples distributing grain, debts rising after bad harvests, and desperate people selling land, labour, or even family members. The evidence from earlier periods is less direct, but the logic is old. Once food is stored and owned, hunger is never only natural. Migration follows hunger, pressure, and fear. A failed farming system does not always produce instant death. It can produce movement. Families leave marginal fields. Herds are driven elsewhere. Young people seek work in towns. Villages shrink. Refugees arrive in places already under strain. Migration can save lives, spread technologies, create new communities, and carry languages across landscapes. It can also provoke conflict when newcomers enter occupied land or compete for water, pasture. And grain, collapse, in this sense, is not disappearance. It is rearrangement under stress. The map changes because people refuse to remain where the old bargain no longer feeds them. Revolt is another form of collapse from within. When harvests fail, taxes do not always fall with them. States and elites may demand the same grain from weaker fields and hungrier households. Officials may squeeze harder precisely when people have least to give. Debt grows. Labour obligations become intolerable. Trust erodes. The ruler's claim to protect cosmic and social order begins to look hollow when children are hungry and storehouses are guarded. The evidence remains incomplete for many early societies, but later records make the pattern painfully clear. Famine, debt, taxation, and forced labour can turn subjects against the systems meant to secure them. A granary can feed loyalty, but an unfair granary can feed rebellion. Epidemic disease can accelerate everything. Malnutrition weakens bodies, crowded settlements spread infection, movement carries pathogens between regions, animals, insects, dirty water, and poor sanitation create chains of vulnerability. A disease outbreak in a stressed farming society is not merely a medical event. It affects labour for planting and harvest. It leaves fields untended, children orphaned, elders unsupported, rituals disrupted, soldiers weakened, and administrators desperate. Some ancient epidemics are difficult to identify with certainty, especially before written descriptions and recoverable pathogen DNA, and scholars still debate many proposed outbreaks. But the connection between settlement, stress, and disease is clear enough. The village and city make human life denser, and density gives illness a road. Political breakdown often looks like mystery from a distance because the visible remains are silent. Archaeologists find abandoned houses, burned layers, broken statues, empty plazas, unfinished buildings, changing pottery styles, hastily buried bodies, interrupted trade, or settlements shifting to safer ground. The temptation is to search for one dramatic cause: drought, invasion, earthquake, plague, rebellion, soil failure, or corrupt rulers. Sometimes one shock may dominate, more often. No single explanation fully accounts for this. Complex societies usually fall through combinations. A drought hurts more if the state is already unequal. War devastates more if harvests are weak. Disease spreads faster if people are displaced. A ruler loses legitimacy faster if storage fails. Collapse is not one hammer blow. It is a roof giving way after many beams have been weakened. The Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia offers one famous example, though it remains debated. Around the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, this early empire weakens and fragments. Some evidence points to severe aridity in parts of the region, possibly contributing to agricultural stress, migration, and political instability. But climate alone cannot explain the whole story. Imperial overreach, local resistance, trade disruption, and internal politics also matter. What survives in the record suggests a world under pressure from more than one direction. The fields, the palace, the army, and the sky are all part of the same story. The decline of many Eastern Mediterranean societies around 1200 BCE shows an even more tangled crisis. Palatial centres fall or shrink, trade networks fracture, writing systems disappear in some places, populations move, warfare, drought, internal unrest, earthquakes, and raiding have all been proposed as factors. The so-called sea peoples appear in Egyptian records, but treating them as the single cause oversimplifies a much wider unravelling. The Late Bronze Age world was highly interconnected, and that interconnection was both strength and weakness. Tin, copper, grain, luxury goods, diplomatic marriages, tribute, and military alliances linked courts across great distances. When one part failed, shocks travelled. Agricultural societies had grown into international systems, and systems can collapse by contagion as well as by invasion. In the Maya lowlands, another pattern emerges. Classic Maya cities flourish with astonishing architecture, writing, astronomy, kingship, agriculture, reservoirs, terraces, and trade. Then many southern lowland cities decline between the 8th and 10th centuries CE. Drought appears to have played an important role, supported by climate evidence from lake sediments and cave deposits. But drought alone does not explain why some places suffered more than others, or why political fragmentation, warfare, elite competition, and environmental stress interacted as they did. Maya civilization does not vanish. Maya people continue, adapt, and live into the present. The mystery is not disappearance, but transformation. A political and urban order breaks while a people survives. That distinction matters everywhere. Civilizations do not disappear the way a candle disappears when blown out. Cities may be abandoned, dynasties may end, scripts may stop being used, monuments may crumble, and trade routes may shift. But people usually remain somewhere, carrying crops, songs, tools, memories, and descendants into new forms of life. The phrase vanished civilization can mislead if it makes survival invisible. Farming societies collapse, but human communities often reassemble. The field may be abandoned in one valley and opened in another. A city's stones may become a village's quarry. A royal road may become a shepherd's path. The dead state becomes part of the living landscape. Still, collapse leaves scars. Famine changes bodies. Migration changes languages. Violence changes settlement patterns. Disease changes families. Debt changes land ownership. The loss of administration can mean freedom from taxation for some and ruin for others who depended on redistribution, irrigation management, or protection. Collapse is not always experienced as pure disaster by everyone. Some people suffer terribly. Others escape oppressive systems. Some elites lose power. Some local communities regain autonomy. The evidence rarely lets us hear all these voices, but it warns against assuming that the fall of a palace is the same as the end of a world for every farmer beneath it. Agriculture makes collapse more dramatic because it builds structures that can fail at scale. A mobile band can disperse, a village can move or shrink, a city of tens of thousands depends on hinterlands, roads, water systems, labour schedules, storage, political trust, and defence. When those systems break, the consequences multiply. The same surplus that made temples and archives possible also made people dependent on administrators, canals, markets. And grain flows they did not personally control. Complexity solves problems by creating new dependencies. Collapse begins when those dependencies become liabilities. There is a strange intimacy between the first seed and the fallen city. The seed promised a future that could be planned. The city expanded that promise into a whole civilization of calendars, taxes, laws, granaries, armies, and monuments. Collapse reveals the fear hidden inside the promise that a planned future can fail more completely because so many lives have been built around it. When the harvest fails for a forager, the group searches wider. When the harvest fails for a state, the failure travels through ledgers, debts, markets, temples, barracks, roads, and kitchens. Hunger becomes administrative before it becomes physical, and by the time it reaches the body, it has passed through power. Yet collapse is also part of the long resilience of farming humanity. People learn from broken irrigation systems, abandoned fields, failed crops, lost forests, and ruined cities. They change crop mixes, move settlements, build terraces, dig reservoirs, shift trade routes, reform laws, forgive debts, or found new states. Sometimes they repeat the same mistakes under new rulers. Sometimes they create more durable arrangements. The record is not a simple warning against agriculture, because there is no going back to a world before the first fields. It is a warning against mistaking surplus for safety, scale for stability, and control for understanding. By the time the granary fails, the story has moved far beyond food. It has become a story about trust. People trust the field to produce, the river to return, the ruler to protect, the storehouse to open, the gods or rituals to hold meaning, the neighbours not to raid, the records to be fair, and the past to predict the future. Collapse is what happens when enough of those trusts break at once. The fields may still be there, lying under a hard sky. The walls may still stand. The jars may still be stacked in dark rooms, but the invisible system that made them function has cracked. And so the agricultural revolution carries within it the possibility of agricultural ruin. Farming allows people to build societies larger than memory, and collapse reminds them that anything larger than memory can fail in ways no one fully sees until too late. The first villages taught humans to stay. The first cities taught them to organise. The first collapses taught them that staying and organising are not the same as permanence. Beneath every granary is a question that never disappears. What happens when the stored future runs out? Not everyone wanted the field. This is one of the most important corrections to the old story of progress, because agriculture did not sweep across the world as an obvious gift that every sensible person accepted at first contact. Many people avoided it, delayed it, sampled it, reshaped it, or took only the pieces that suited them. Some communities lived near farmers for centuries without becoming farmers themselves. Some traded with agricultural neighbours while keeping older lifeways. Some adopted animals but not crops, crops but not full settlement, gardens but not grain states, or seasonal cultivation without surrendering mobility. The human past is not a single road from hunting to farming to civilization. It is a braided river full of side channels, reversals, and deliberate refusals. Foragers resisted farming because they were not ignorant of it. In many cases, they understood exactly what farming required. They saw the labour, they saw the disease, they saw the narrower diet, they saw the way fields tied people to place and made them vulnerable to rulers, raiders, debts, and bad weather. They may also have seen farmers as poor, overworked, crowded, and strangely trapped, from the viewpoint of a skilled hunter, fisher, gatherer, or mobile herder living in a productive landscape. The farmer's life was not obviously superior. A person who can move through forests, coasts, wetlands, or grasslands with deep knowledge may not envy someone who spends days weeding grain under obligation to a landlord, chief, temple, or tax collector. In northern Europe, farming spread gradually from communities already transformed in Southwest Asia and Anatolia, but it did not simply replace local foragers overnight. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers continued to live along coasts, rivers, and forests, while farming groups moved in with crops, animals, pottery, and different settlement patterns. There was contact, exchange, intermarriage, conflict, imitation, and separation. In some places, foragers adopted pottery before agriculture. In others, they traded for domestic animals or crops without fully changing their way of life. The evidence remains incomplete, but ancient DNA, tools, food residues, and settlement patterns all suggest a complicated frontier rather than a clean cultural handover. The coast is especially important. Rich marine environments can support dense populations without farming. Shellfish beds, fish runs, sea mammals, seabirds, edible plants, and trade routes along water can make mobility and settlement coexist in ways that challenge the simple farming story. Along parts of the Pacific Northwest, much later in history, complex hunter-gatherer societies developed social hierarchy, storage, art, and large settlements without relying on agriculture in the standard cereal field sense. This shows that farming is not the only path to complexity. Surplus can come from salmon as well as barley. A granary can be replaced by a smokehouse, a fish weir, or a clam garden. The key is not farming alone, but reliable abundance that can be stored, managed, claimed, and defended. In Japan, the Jomon world offers another striking example. For thousands of years, people lived with pottery, settled or semi-settled villages, rich fishing, gathering, hunting, nut processing, ritual objects, and regional networks. Long before wet rice farming became dominant with Lady Yayoi influences, pottery appears there very early, not as a marker of farming, but as part of a foraging or broad-spectrum subsistence world. This surprises anyone who expects pottery to belong neatly to farmers. It reminds us that the package of civilization was never really a package. People could take containers without fields, villages without grain states, ritual complexity without ploughs, and storage without domesticated cereals. In Australia, Aboriginal peoples maintained extraordinarily sophisticated land management systems for tens of thousands of years without adopting agriculture in the conventional Old World sense. Fire stick farming, seasonal movement, knowledge of plant cycles, fish traps, yam grounds, seed processing, and aquaculture-like practices in some regions show a deep shaping of landscape that does not fit the crude category of simple hunting and gathering. The evidence of places such as ancient fish trap systems reveals engineering, planning, and ecological knowledge, but not necessarily a transition into ploughed fields and grain-based states. This has led some scholars and indigenous thinkers to challenge the sharp boundary between foraging and farming itself. Categories are useful, but the real world is often more subtle than the categories. In the Americas, many societies cultivated plants while continuing to hunt, fish, gather, and move seasonally. Maize took thousands of years to become the dominant staple in many regions after its initial domestication. Early maize cobs were small, and for a long time maize may have been one food among many rather than the centre of life. In parts of eastern North America, people domesticated local plants such as goosefoot, sumpweed, sunflower, and squash before maize became central. Some groups gardened river bottoms while still relying heavily on wild foods. Farming did not arrive as a switch, it was a long negotiation. Why resist one answer is risk? Farming can fail catastrophically. A diverse foraging economy may be more resilient in some environments, especially where wild resources are rich and predictable. Another answer is labour. Farming often requires more hours of repetitive work than foraging in favourable environments. A third is health. Crowding and diet can make farmers visibly less well. A fourth is freedom. Mobility allows people to leave bad leaders, bad neighbours, failed resources, or rising obligations. Once land, houses, and stores bind people in place, power can become harder to escape. A foraging group may look poor to a farmer who measures wealth in stored goods, but rich in options to itself. There is also cultural meaning. People do not choose food systems only by calories. They choose them through identity, ritual, taste, memory, pride, and relationships with animals, plants, ancestors, and places. A group may reject farming because it belongs to others, because it violates valued forms of life, because it threatens gender roles or sharing customs, because it creates unacceptable dependence, or because the land itself is understood through movement rather than ownership. Scholars still debate how to interpret resistance in particular cases, but it is clear that agriculture spread through persuasion, exchange, pressure, population growth, colonization, and sometimes force, not because everyone immediately recognized it as better. Farmers and foragers often became entangled. Farmers needed wild products, trade routes, hunting knowledge, marriage partners, and sometimes protection or labour. Foragers could obtain grain, pottery, metal tools, cloth, or animals from farmers. Frontiers were zones of exchange as much as conflict, but frontiers also became zones of disease, displacement, and cultural pressure. Farming populations often grew faster, and over generations they could expand into lands used by foragers. Clearing forests and changing animal populations, resistance could last centuries and still lose ground to demography. The farmer's advantage was not always a better daily life, it was numbers. Some foragers became specialists in the spaces farming states did not control well. Marshes, mountains, deserts, forests, and steppe frontiers often sheltered people who avoided taxation, conscription, and settled authority. Later states frequently describe such groups as barbarians, savages, bandits, or backward people, but those labels reveal the state's frustration as much as reality. The hills and wetlands could be zones of refuge. To avoid the plough might also mean avoiding the tax list. To keep moving might be a political choice. No single explanation fully accounts for every case, but across history, many people lived at the edge of farming states precisely because the centre demanded too much. Pastoralists complicate the picture further. Herding societies often depend on domesticated animals but resist settled farming and state control. They may trade meat, milk, wool, hides, horses, camels, or other animals for grain and metal goods. They may raid farming settlements or protect them. They may become conquerors of agricultural states or clients of them. Their mobility gives military and political advantages in some landscapes. While their dependence on pasture and water creates vulnerabilities of its own, herding is part of the agricultural revolution, but it can also become a way to escape the full discipline of the field. The refusal of farming helps reveal what farming truly is. It is not simply food production. It is a social order built around staying, storing, claiming, inheriting, scheduling, and intensifying. A community may reject one or more of those demands even while accepting useful crops or animals. This is why the transition often takes so long. People are not deciding whether to eat grain, they are deciding whether to reorganize life around grain. Those are very different choices. There is a quiet tragedy in how the old foraging worlds disappear from many regions. Some vanish through assimilation, some through displacement, some through disease, some through intermarriage, some through environmental transformation, and some through state violence. But there is also continuity. Many modern peoples preserve knowledge, languages, practices, and relationships to land that descend from non-agricultural or mixed lifeways. They are not living fossils. And it would be wrong to treat them as windows into an unchanged past. They are contemporary peoples with histories of their own. Still, their existence reminds us that farming was never humanity's only way to be intelligent, social, spiritual, and complex. The old myth says agriculture was the moment humans stopped being wild and became civilized. The evidence tells a stranger story. Many people looked at the field and hesitated. Some saw promise, some saw trouble, some took seeds and refused the rest. Some remained near rivers, coasts, forests, deserts, and herds, building lives that did not fit the later agricultural state's definition of progress. Their resistance matters because it proves that the farming bargain was visible enough to be judged. It was not destiny disguised as discovery. It was a choice made under pressure, repeated across generations, and often accepted only after other choices had been narrowed. By the time farming societies spread widely, the people who resisted had already asked the question that still unsettles the whole story. Better for whom? Better for the population? Perhaps. Better for the crop species? Certainly. Better for rulers, armies, cities, and scribes? Often. But better for each individual body, each household, each landscape, each way of understanding freedom? The answer is less certain. The field conquered much of the world, but not because it always offered the happiest life. It conquered because it could feed more people, bind them in place, and reproduce its own demands with terrifying effectiveness. The upgrade that conquered did not win because it made every life better. It won because it made more lives. That distinction is cold, but it explains much of the human past. A farming village can support more people on the same area of land than most foraging systems. Even if the diet is narrower, the labour harder, and the disease burden heavier. More people mean more hands to clear fields, more children to inherit them, more bodies to defend them, more workers to dig canals, more mouths to justify expansion, and eventually more soldiers to carry the system outward. Agriculture spreads not like a good idea alone, but like a demographic force. It fills space. This is why the agricultural revolution becomes nearly irreversible in many regions once it passes a certain threshold. A small farming community may struggle. It may be less healthy than its foraging neighbours. It may work longer hours and face new diseases, but if it raises more surviving children over generations, its descendants become more numerous. They need more land. Forest becomes field, marsh becomes garden, steppe becomes pasture, hillsides are terraced, rivers are diverted. The population that farming creates becomes the reason farming must expand. Growth is no longer just an outcome. It becomes a requirement. Expansion can happen quietly. A daughter settlement appears near an older village. Younger sons and daughters move to new land. Families clear the next valley. Crops and animals spread through exchange and marriage. Local foragers adopt some practices. Farmers learn local plants and conditions. Languages shift slowly. Genes mix. Pottery styles change. Tools move. There may be no invasion in the dramatic sense. Only a long frontier of contact where one way of life gradually becomes harder to maintain beside another that produces more people. But expansion can also happen violently, with land seizure, raiding, enslavement, burning, displacement, and domination. The evidence varies by region, and scholars still debate the balance of migration, cultural adoption, and conflict in many agricultural spreads. What is clear is that farming carries pressure with it. Grain is especially suited to conquest because it can be taken. A field cannot run away. A harvest can be seized. A granary can be taxed. A ration can feed a worker or a soldier far from home. Root crops, tree crops, and mixed gardens can support rich societies too, but grains have a particular relationship with states. They ripen at predictable times, grow in visible fields, store in measurable units, and travel in sacks. This makes them legible to power. A ruler does not need to know every household intimately if officials can measure fields and count grain. The crop becomes a bridge between soil and state. Armies grow out of this bridge. Warriors need food, and farming produces the stored surplus that lets some people fight while others farm. Larger populations supply recruits. Roads and administrative systems move rations. Conquered lands provide more grain, animals, labour, and taxes. This creates a feedback loop. Farming supports states. States support armies. Armies seize land. Land supports more farming. Not every farming society becomes expansionist. And not every state is equally militarised, but the capacity is built into the system. The plough and the sword are not the same tool, yet they often travel together. Disease also helps farming societies conquer, though often in terrible and unintended ways. Dense settlements and close animal contact expose agricultural populations to pathogens that can become devastating when carried into groups without prior exposure. The most catastrophic examples occur much later, especially after transoceanic contact brings Old World diseases to indigenous peoples of the Americas, causing mortality on a scale that reshapes world history. That disaster belongs to a later age, with ships, empires, and global exchange, but its deep roots lie partly in the disease environments created by farming, herding, crowding, and cities. Agriculture does not merely feed conquerors, it helps create the microbial worlds that travel with them. Technology spreads with farming as well. Pottery, weaving, metallurgy, wheeled vehicles in some regions, ploughs, irrigation tools, storage systems, writing, and organised labour all build on agricultural surplus, though not all appear everywhere or in the same order. Each technology gives farming societies new ways to intensify production, expand territory, or coordinate people. Metal axes clear forests faster, ploughs open heavier soils, carts move harvests, ships carry grain across seas. Writing tracks debts and taxes. Coinage later turns food and labour into abstract value. The field becomes connected to a widening machinery of extraction and exchange. But conquest is not only military or technological, it is also imaginative. Farming societies often come to define themselves as settled, ordered, proper, civilised, and morally superior, while describing mobile peoples as wild, lazy, dangerous, or backward. These labels are not neutral observations. They help justify expansion. If fields represent order, then forests, marshes, steppes, and mountains can be imagined as empty or underused even when they are full of human knowledge and history. The agricultural state often sees land most clearly when it can be taxed. Everything else becomes shadowy, suspicious, or available. This way of seeing is powerful because it turns ecological diversity into a hierarchy of value. A forest that feeds hunters, gatherers, honey collectors, herbalists, and spirits may appear wasted to a grain state. A wetland that supports fish, reeds, birds, tubers, and seasonal camps may appear as land waiting to be drained. A grassland shared by pastoralists may appear empty to officials who want fields. The upgrade conquers partly by redefining what counts as productive. Productivity becomes what can be measured, stored, taxed, and traded. Much is lost in that narrowing. Still, agriculture also conquers because people want what it offers: security, or the hope of it, more children, stored food, permanent houses, ancestral land, ceremonies tied to harvest, cloth, pottery, metal, salt, beer, bread, markets, protection, and belonging. It would be too simple to imagine farming spreading only by coercion. Many communities adopt crops and animals because they see advantages, especially when population pressure, climate stress, trade opportunities, or social competition make older strategies less reliable. The field can look like freedom from hunger before it becomes obligation. The village can look like safety before it becomes a tax base. Agriculture's greatest weapon may be normality. Once children are born into farming, the field is not a choice but the shape of the world. They learn the calendar before they can question it. They inherit the idea that land should be worked, grain stored, animals managed, and houses maintained. They hear stories in which harvest means blessing and barren ground means danger. They marry into households measured partly by land and labour. They bury their dead near fields. They teach their own children the same rhythms. A system that once had to persuade becomes tradition. Tradition then feels like nature. The spread of farming also transforms language and ancestry. In many parts of the world, agricultural expansion is linked with the movement of language families, though the details remain debated. Farming populations grow, migrate, mix, and sometimes replace or absorb earlier groups. Languages tied to agricultural communities can spread across vast regions, carrying words for crops, animals, tools, kinship, and social order. But language spread does not always mean total population replacement. People can adopt a language through marriage, trade, prestige, conquest, or survival. The evidence from archaeology, genetics, and linguistics is powerful but complex. What it suggests is that farming did not merely change diets, it helped redraw the human map. The ecological map changes even more. Crop plants become global travellers: wheat, rice, maize, potatoes, sugarcane, bananas, sorghum, millet, beans, and many others move far beyond their original ranges. Domestic animals reshape continents: cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, horses, chickens, llamas, alpacas, camels, donkeys, and water buffalo alter vegetation, labour, transport, diet, warfare, and wealth. The The human species becomes a dispersal engine for other species. Some flourish wildly under human protection. Others disappear as habitats are cleared, hunted, fenced, or invaded. Farming conquers by building alliances with a small set of species and making the rest of the landscape adjust around them. There is an unsettling irony here. The crops and animals humans domesticated become among the most successful organisms on Earth, while many wild species decline. From an evolutionary perspective, wheat and rice are triumphs. Cattle and chickens become astonishingly numerous. Humans do multiply. But success measured in numbers is not the same as success measured in freedom, health, dignity, or ecological balance. The agricultural upgrade is magnificent if counted by population, biomass. Monuments and technological possibility, it is more troubling if counted by suffering, confinement, extinction, soil loss, and dependence. No single explanation fully accounts for why farming conquered so much of the planet. Climate made it possible, plants and animals made it practical, storage made it powerful, population made it expansionary, states made it coercive, culture made it meaningful, disease made it devastating in some encounters, technology made it scalable, inheritance made it durable. Each factor strengthened the others. The field was never just a field. It was the seed of a system that could reproduce itself through bodies, beliefs, tools, armies, and landscapes. By the time agriculture dominates much of the inhabited world, its victory is so complete that it becomes difficult to imagine the alternatives. History itself begins to be written mostly by agricultural states, which means the old mobile worlds are often described from the outside, if they are described at all. The conqueror controls not only land, but memory. The people who resisted farming are labelled as remnants, obstacles, curiosities, or ancestors left behind. Yet in truth, they preserve part of the older human inheritance, the knowledge that settlement is not the only form of intelligence, that storage is not the only form of security, and that civilization is not the only form of complexity. The upgrade conquered because it was reproductively, politically, and materially powerful. It created dense populations that could overwhelm, absorb, or outlast neighbours. It created states that could command labour and violence. It created surplus that could feed specialists and soldiers. It created traditions that made its demands feel sacred or inevitable. It created landscapes where leaving became harder with each generation, and once it conquered. It gave humanity the tools to do astonishing things, heal diseases, cross oceans, measure stars, build libraries, compose laws, preserve memory, and eventually ask whether the first field had been a blessing or a mistake. That question survives because conquest is not the same as vindication. Agriculture won, but victory does not prove innocence. Many things win because they are powerful, not because they are kind. The field spread across the world carrying bread, beer, birth, empire, famine, song, taxation, plague, inheritance, and hope. It multiplied humans beyond anything the old foraging world could sustain. It made civilization possible. It also made civilization hungry. And once a hungry civilization learns to expand, it rarely stops at the edge of the first field. The mistake we still live inside is not that humans learn to grow food. That would be too simple and too unfair to the millions of patient hands that kept children alive through droughts, winters, floods, and hunger. The mistake is deeper and harder to escape. It is the belief that the world can be made permanently obedient if enough land is cleared, enough water diverted, enough seed improved, enough animals bred, enough labour organised, enough numbers recorded, and enough surplus stored. Agriculture begins as a way to reduce uncertainty. Over time, it teaches humanity to build systems so large that uncertainty does not disappear. It only moves into the foundations. Every modern city is still a distant echo of the first granary. Food arrives from somewhere else. Most people no longer see the fields, herds, fisheries, warehouses, roads, ports, fertilizers, irrigation systems, migrant labour, machines, debts, and weather patterns that keep them alive. The old village at least knew the field by sight. The modern world often knows food as packaging, price, habit, and convenience. Yet the dependence is greater than ever. Billions of people live because farming became astonishingly productive, and billions are vulnerable because that productivity depends on soil, water, climate, energy, transport, politics, and trust working together. This is the final transformation of the agricultural revolution. It becomes invisible. The field disappears behind civilization, but civilization never stops needing it. Grain becomes bread, then wage, then tax, then empire, then market, then global supply chain. The seed that once tied a village to a hillside now ties continents together. Wheat failures in one region affect prices in another. Drought in a river basin can unsettle cities far away. A disease among animals can alter trade. A war near farmland can disturb dinner tables across oceans. The farming trap has expanded until it is no longer a local trap. It is planetary. The ecological consequences are now vast. Agriculture occupies enormous areas of Earth's land surface. Forests have been cleared for crops and pasture. Rivers have been dammed, diverted, and drained. Wetlands have vanished. Grasslands have been ploughed. Soils have been exhausted, rebuilt, chemically fed, eroded, and compacted. Fertilizers have increased yields beyond anything ancient farmers could imagine, but they have also altered nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. Pesticides protect crops while harming other forms of life when misused or overused. Irrigation feeds millions while drawing down aquifers laid down over deep time. The evidence is no longer fragmentary. The agricultural system that made dense civilization possible has become one of the main forces reshaping the planet. And still, it feeds us. That is what makes the judgment so difficult. Agriculture is not a villain standing outside humanity. It is humanity's body extended into the soil. It is breakfast, childhood, medicine, population, memory, and survival. The same system that damages rivers also keeps hospitals, schools, and homes alive. The same grain fields that simplified ecosystems also made possible libraries, observatories, vaccines, music, mathematics, and the long chain of knowledge that allows people to understand the damage. Farming created the problem and the intelligence with which to recognize it. No single explanation fully accounts for this contradiction, because it is not merely historical, it is moral, ecological, and personal. The ancient bargain still appears in modern form. More yield can mean more security, but also more dependence on fewer crops. More efficiency can mean cheaper food, but also fragile supply chains. More meat can mean wealth and status, but also land pressure, water use, emissions, and animal suffering. More control can mean fewer famines in some regions, but also new vulnerabilities when climate shifts faster than crops, infrastructure, and politics can adapt. Humanity still tries to solve the problems of agriculture with more agriculture, more technology, more coordination, more measurement, more extraction, and sometimes more humility. The outcome remains uncertain. There are signs of learning. Farmers across the world use old and new methods to protect soil, conserve water, diversify crops, restore forests, rotate grazing, reduce chemical dependence, save seeds, revive traditional knowledge, and adapt to changing climates. Scientists study ancient terraces, raised fields, agroforestry, indigenous land management, drought-resistant crops, and soil microbiomes. Some of the future may lie in remembering what industrial agriculture forgot. That a field is not a factory floor, soil is not inert dust, water is not merely input, and food is not only a commodity. What survives from older farming worlds suggests both warning and wisdom. Some societies exhausted their lands, others managed them with care for astonishing lengths of time. But the central tension remains. Agriculture wants stability in a world that is not stable. It wants predictability from weather, fertility from soil, obedience from plants, reproduction from animals, labour from people, and patience from the future. When it works, it feels like mastery. When it fails, the older truth returns: humans are not outside nature, and civilization is not exempt from hunger. The first farmers learned this in their bodies. Modern societies may learn it through markets. Migration, heat, water scarcity, and failing harvests. The scale has changed, but the bargain is recognisable. So was farming humanity's greatest upgrade or worst mistake? It was both, because it changed the question from how a small group survives within a landscape to how an entire species reorganises landscapes around itself. It gave humans power beyond any earlier way of life. It also made humans dependent on the consequences of that power. It turned seeds into cities, villages into states, food into wealth, land into property, time into schedules, surplus into hierarchy, and survival into administration. It allowed billions to live, and it placed billions inside systems that must not fail. The first field is still with us. It is present in the bread on a table, the rice in a bowl, the corn in a field, the cattle behind fences, the irrigation canal, the supermarket shelf, the freight ship, the tax record, the weather forecast, the soil sample, and the anxious glance toward a changing sky. Humanity did not leave the agricultural revolution behind. Humanity became the creature made by it. The old forager still lives somewhere in the human body, restless, observant, adapted to variety and movement. But the farmer built the modern world, and the modern world still rises each morning needing the harvest. And after all the fields, all the storehouses, all the cities, and all the empires, the story settles back into something very small, a seed in a human hand. It is light enough to be lost in dust, but heavy enough to bend the course of history. It carries food, labour, memory, danger, and hope. It carries the promise that tomorrow can be prepared for, and the warning that tomorrow can never be fully owned. The first farmers are gone, but the world they began remains under our feet. Their fields have become our nations, their storage pits our economies, their seasonal fears our climate reports, their village obligations our crowded systems of dependence. We live among their consequences every day, usually without noticing. The ancient bargain has become ordinary. We call it breakfast. We call it work. We call it home. Yet the land still remembers. Soil remembers roots and rain. Rivers remember their old courses. Forests remember the spaces they once filled. Animals remember, in their bodies, the long reshaping of human need. Even crops remember, in their altered forms, the thousands of seasons during which people chose, saved, planted, and harvested them. Civilization often speaks as if it stands above nature, but the field never lets that illusion last forever. Sooner or later, every society must return to the same quiet negotiation: what can be taken, what must be given back, and what happens when the balance is ignored. Farming did not make humans less mysterious, it made them more so. It revealed a species capable of patience and violence, care and domination, invention and blindness. A species that can feed strangers across continents and also exhaust the ground beneath its own future. A species that can turn grass into bread, bread into cities, cities into memory, and memory into warnings it may or may not heed. Somewhere, long ago, a person pushed seed into soil without knowing what would follow. No throne appeared, no city rose in that instant, no written law declared the beginning of a new age. There was only earth, weather, hunger, and trust. The seed disappeared beneath the surface, the people waited, and in that waiting the human world began to change. It is still changing, the field is still open, the harvest is not yet finished.